a skull sealed with a smile, footprints ending at solid rock, a message carved centuries before its meaning could be understood. Each clue feels like a crack in reality, small enough to overlook, yet deep enough to unsettle everything. The past leaves no explanations, only fragments, waiting for someone brave enough to connect them. High above the Javiketi Plateau, where the Lesser Caucasus rise into a world of volcanic ridges, thin air, and long horizons, the ruins of Shaori Fortress sit upon Mount Shaori like a fragment of another age. At roughly 2,752 meters above sea level, the site commands an extraordinary view toward the surrounding mountains and Lake Paravani. But Shaori is not the kind of fortress most people associate with the word. There are no medieval towers, royal halls, or decorated gateways. Instead, its walls belong to the much older Cyclopean tradition of the South Caucasus, constructed from enormous basalt blocks placed together without mortar. The surviving structure occupies two steep peaks, with a central fortified section positioned on the highest ground. The setting itself immediately raises a question of purpose. Why build a fortified complex so high above the surrounding landscape? One practical explanation is defense. From such a position, movement across the plateau could be observed from a considerable distance, while the steep terrain would have made a direct assault difficult. Georgia's official tourism information describes Shaori as a megalithic complex dating broadly to the 2nd millennium BC and suggests that it may have served as a temporary residence for tribal chiefs and as a refuge during periods of conflict. Ancient settlements have also been identified around the mountain's base, yet the architecture leaves room for other interpretations. Shaori is associated with a wider network of Cyclopean hill forts scattered through the mountainous regions of southern Georgia. Its closest architectural comparison is often considered the Abuli Fortress, another massive high-altitude structure near Lake Paravani. These sites reveal a landscape in which elevated strongholds may have played several roles at once: defensive positions, places of authority, seasonal centers, and perhaps locations connected with ritual activity. The difficulty is that Shaori has never received the kind of extensive archaeological investigation that would settle many of these questions. Its exact construction date therefore remains uncertain. Comparisons with Bronze Age sites and burial traditions in the wider region have led researchers to place its construction broadly within the 2nd millennium BC, but that remains an archaeological estimate rather than a precisely established date. And this uncertainty changes how the fortress appears. The stones themselves are silent. They reveal extraordinary labor, but not necessarily the people who organized it. They show that communities possess the ability to transport and arrange massive volcanic blocks at a remote elevation, yet they do not tell us exactly why the summit mattered so much. Some interpretations have suggested that the unusual location and internal arrangement may indicate more than simple habitation. The steep terrain and spatial organization make ordinary domestic occupation less convincing, leading some scholars to consider possible ritual or religious functions alongside defensive ones. That possibility has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some fringe discussions have imagined Shaori as a ceremonial mountain sanctuary, an astronomical observation point, or evidence of a forgotten culture whose social organization was more sophisticated than the surviving record suggests. There is currently no reliable evidence proving such claims, but neither can the stones themselves explain precisely how their builders understood this extraordinary landscape. Perhaps that is the most compelling feature of Shaori. It does not require a fantastic explanation to become mysterious. A prehistoric society climbed into an unforgiving mountain environment and constructed a monumental complex from basalt, choosing a location where altitude, isolation, and natural defenses transformed the mountain itself into part of the architecture. Yet, the identity of its builders, the exact chronology, and the full purpose of the complex remain incompletely understood. And when the wind moves through the broken walls today, the unanswered questions seem almost as permanent as the stones themselves. From the high, wind-cut walls of Shaori, the journey now moves southward, away from the volcanic mountains of the Caucasus and toward the broad plains of Mesopotamia. Here, the landscape changes completely. Mountains give way to dust, rivers, reeds, and an ancient horizon broken by a single enormous silhouette. At Akar Kuf, west of modern Baghdad, the remains of Dur-Kurigalzu rise from the flat Iraqi landscape. The most striking feature is its ziggurat, a vast, stepped monument whose surviving core still reaches roughly 50 meters above the surrounding plain. Weathered by thousands of years, it resembles a colossal earthen mountain, its surfaces scarred by erosion, yet its basic form remains unmistakably monumental. There is something unsettling about seeing it in isolation. The city that once surrounded this structure has largely disappeared into the earth. Palaces, temples, residences, administrative buildings, streets, and canals once formed a substantial urban center. Today, the ziggurat dominates the ruins like a memory that refused to disappear. Its story begins during the Kassite period of Mesopotamia, sometime in the 14th century BC. The Kassites ruled Babylonia for several centuries, approximately from the second half of the second millennium BC into the 12th century BC. Their kingdom is less familiar to modern audiences than those of the Sumerians, Assyrians, or Babylonians, yet their influence was considerable. King Kurigalzu I established Dur-Kurigalzu as a major royal center, and the city became an important political and religious location within Kassite Babylonia. The name itself carries the king's identity. Dur-Kurigalzu can be understood as the fortress or settlement of Kurigalzu. But the ziggurat was not simply a monument to royal ambition. It was part of a sacred landscape. The structure was dedicated to Enlil, one of the most important gods of Mesopotamian religion. The temple complex surrounding it connected political authority with divine order, as was common throughout Mesopotamia. A ziggurat was not designed as an ordinary building that people entered from the ground and occupied like a palace. It was a monumental platform elevating a sacred space above the city, visually separating the divine realm from everyday life. And yet, standing before Dur-Kurigalzu today, it is difficult to understand exactly what the original monument looked like. The upper stages have been lost. The surfaces that once gave the structure its finished appearance have disappeared. What remains is largely the enormous internal mass of mud brick. Ancient builders compensated for the weakness of sun-dried brick by incorporating layers of reeds and other materials into the structure. UNESCO's recent documentation describes the monument as an extraordinary example of Kassite engineering, with ancient reed mats and twisted ropes incorporated into its construction. It is an almost paradoxical object. Mud brick is fragile. Yet, this fragile material became a mountain. That raises another question. How did an ancient society transform ordinary earth, water, plant fibers, labor, and organization into something capable of surviving for thousands of years? The answer is partly practical. Mesopotamian builders had centuries of accumulated architectural knowledge. They understood how to work with local materials, how to raise massive platforms, and how to protect important structures from the environment. The surrounding city also benefited from canals and carefully managed water systems, demonstrating that Dur-Kurigalzu was not an isolated monument, but part of a sophisticated urban landscape. Still, practical explanations do not make the monument less mysterious. In fact, they can make it more intriguing, because the more we understand about the engineering, the more clearly we see the scale of human coordination required to build it. Thousands of workers would have been involved in producing, transporting, drying, placing, and maintaining enormous quantities of brick. Food had to be supplied. Labor had to be organized. Materials had to be gathered. Religious officials, administrators, craftsmen, and builders all had to function within a complex social system. The ziggurat therefore represents more than architecture. It represents a civilization capable of turning belief into physical geography. And there is another layer to its mystery. For centuries, travelers from the West encountered the enormous ruin and sometimes associated it with the biblical Tower of Babel. That identification was incorrect, but it reveals something important about how powerful the monument appeared even long after its original religious meaning had disappeared. UNESCO records that the ziggurat was repeatedly mistaken for the Tower of Babel by Western visitors. The comparison is understandable. Both were imagined as immense structures reaching toward the heavens. Both belong to the cultural world of ancient Mesopotamia, and both became symbols of humanity's desire to build upward, toward something beyond ordinary existence. But Dur-Kurigalzu was not a mysterious structure imported from an unknown civilization. Its archaeological context firmly places it within the Kassite world. The real uncertainty lies elsewhere. How much of the city have we actually recovered? How many structures remain concealed beneath the soil? And how much of the original religious landscape has been erased by time? Excavations began in earnest during the 20th century. Iraqi archaeologists played a major role in the early investigations, with systematic work taking place during the 1940s. Excavators traced the ziggurat's sides and identified a triple staircase on its southeastern face. Stamped bricks helped confirm the site's connection with Dur-Kurigalzu. Later, investigations revealed additional parts of the settlement, including temple areas, palace remains, painted plaster fragments, cylinder seals, figurines, and cuneiform tablets. These discoveries provide glimpses into daily life, administration, religion, and royal culture during the Kassite period. Yet, archaeology often works through fragments. A brick may preserve the name of a king. A tablet may preserve a transaction. A wall may reveal the outline of a vanished room. But none of these fragments necessarily tells us how the entire place felt when it was alive. Picture the city, then. The ziggurat freshly maintained. Its surfaces brighter than the weathered remains visible today. Temples functioning below. Workers moving through streets. Priests performing rituals. Officials recording information on clay. Royal authority concentrated within a city deliberately established to express power and religious legitimacy. Then, centuries pass. The Kassite dynasty falls. The political system changes. The city loses its central importance. Buildings collapse. Mud brick dissolves into the earth. And gradually, the enormous ziggurat becomes something different. Not a living center, but a surviving landmark. This transformation may explain why Dur-Kurigalzu has acquired a strange aura in modern discussions. Its size is immediately visible, while its original purpose requires reconstruction through archaeology. That gap between what can be seen and what can be known creates fertile ground for speculation. Some fringe interpretations have treated the monument as evidence of forgotten technologies, unusual astronomical knowledge, or functions extending beyond conventional religious architecture. Others have suggested that its elevated position may have had a more complex astronomical or symbolic purpose than surviving records reveal. There is no compelling evidence that Dur-Kurigalzu required an extraordinary technology, and there is no archaeological consensus that it served as a secret astronomical device. But dismissing every unanswered detail would be just as misleading. Mesopotamian temples were deeply connected with the heavens, calendars, kingship, ritual, and the movement of celestial bodies. Ancient observers carefully watched the sky and astronomical knowledge became an important part of Mesopotamian intellectual traditions. So, perhaps the more interesting question is not whether the ziggurat was some hidden machine. Perhaps it is why ancient people felt compelled to construct such immense monuments between earth and sky in the first place. The answer may have been religious. It may have been political. It may have been both. At Dur-Kurigalzu, those possibilities seem impossible to separate, and the city itself remains only partially understood. Much of the ancient settlement still lies beneath layers of soil and later disturbance, while erosion and modern development continue to threaten the archaeological landscape. Recent Iraqi and international efforts have focused on documenting, conserving, and better understanding the site. So, the Great Ziggurat remains where it has stood for millennia, stripped of its original colors, its temples silent, its surrounding city reduced to fragments. A monument built to connect the earthly world with the divine now survives as an archaeological question. Perhaps that is the quiet mystery of Dur-Kurigalzu, not that its builders possessed knowledge beyond their age, but that so much of what they knew has disappeared while their monument remains. And somewhere beneath the surrounding earth, beneath layers of collapsed brick and forgotten streets, there may still be details capable of changing how we understand the people who built this extraordinary place. The immense silhouette of Dur-Kurigalzu now gives way to another monument shaped by earth, power, and belief. Far from the plains of Mesopotamia, on the arid northern coast of Peru, an enormous adobe structure rises from a landscape where the mountains meet the Pacific desert. Its surfaces are weathered and broken, but its scale remains unmistakable. This is Huaca del Sol, the Temple of the Sun, one of the greatest monumental constructions associated with the Moche civilization. From a distance, it can resemble a natural mountain. Up close, the illusion disappears. The walls are made from millions of adobe bricks, stacked into a massive stepped structure that once dominated the Moche capital of Cerro Blanco, near modern Trujillo. At its height, the monument is believed to have reached roughly 40 meters, while its enormous base stretched for hundreds of meters across the valley. And yet, the most remarkable feature may not be its size. It is the fact that so much of it was built from mud. In one of the driest environments on Earth, the Moche transformed simple earth and water into monumental architecture. Brick by brick, they created a structure that could be seen from great distances, rising above the surrounding settlement like an artificial mountain. Who ordered such a monument to be built? Who provided the enormous labor force? And what did people experience when they stood before it nearly 15 centuries ago? The Moche flourished along Peru's northern coast roughly between AD 100 and 800. They did not leave behind a conventional written history, so much of what we know about them comes from archaeology, architecture, ceramics, burial sites, and remarkably detailed artistic representations. Huaca del Sol was constructed in several stages over generations, suggesting that it was not the product of one brief burst of activity. Instead, the monument evolved as the society around it changed. That detail is important. A building repeatedly enlarged and modified over time is more than a monument. It becomes a record of changing priorities. At Cerro Blanco, Huaca del Sol stood opposite another major complex, Huaca de la Luna. Between them lay an extensive urban area containing residential structures, workshops, ceremonial spaces, and evidence of organized production. The arrangement suggests that the two huacas formed part of a larger ceremonial and political center, rather than existing as isolated monuments. Huaca de la Luna is especially famous for its painted reliefs depicting supernatural beings, warriors, ritual scenes, and the powerful figure commonly known as the Decapitator. These images have helped researchers reconstruct aspects of Moche religion and ceremonial practice. Huaca del Sol, by contrast, has suffered far greater destruction. and this is where its history takes a darker turn. During the Spanish colonial period, treasure hunters believed that enormous quantities of precious metals might be concealed within the monument. In an attempt to reach whatever wealth they imagined was hidden inside, the Spanish diverted part of the nearby Moche River toward Huaca del Sol. Water began cutting through the adobe structure. The result was catastrophic. Large portions of the monument were eroded away, leaving a deep scar that still marks the surviving remains. The irony is difficult to miss. A monument created through generations of controlled labor was partially destroyed in pursuit of wealth that may never have existed in the quantities imagined. But the damage also created one of archaeology's most enduring questions. How much of Huaca del Sol has already been lost, and how much of its original meaning disappeared with it? Unlike a stone monument, an adobe structure can preserve information in remarkably fragile ways. Walls may collapse, surfaces can erode, paint disappears, rooms become indistinguishable from the earth surrounding them. Yet, archaeologists have recovered enough evidence to reveal that the complex was far more sophisticated than its battered appearance might suggest. The construction itself required extraordinary organization. Adobe bricks had to be produced in enormous numbers. Clay had to be gathered and mixed. Water had to be transported. Workers had to manufacture, dry, move, and position the bricks. Different parts of the monument were built according to planned architectural stages. Some bricks even carry distinctive maker's marks. These marks have provided archaeologists with clues about labor organization, suggesting that groups of workers may have produced and contributed batches of bricks under organized systems of collective obligation. In other words, the monument may preserve something more intimate than royal ambition. It may preserve traces of thousands of ordinary people. Their names are mostly unknown. Their voices are gone, but their labor remains embedded within the walls. This creates a different kind of mystery. How does a society persuade or compel so many people to spend years constructing a monument of this scale? Religion undoubtedly played an important role. Moche society appears to have been deeply ceremonial, and elite authority was closely connected with supernatural forces, warfare, sacrifice, and agricultural fertility. In a region where water was precious and unpredictable, monumental architecture could have helped express control over both the physical and spiritual forces believed to govern life. Huaca del Sol may therefore have served several functions simultaneously. It could have been a political center, a ceremonial monument, a place connected with elite authority, and a symbol of the relationship between rulers, gods, land, and water. But exactly how these functions were divided remains difficult to reconstruct. Some popular accounts have described Huaca del Sol as a temple entirely devoted to sun worship. The name itself encourages that interpretation. Yet the modern name does not necessarily preserve the monument's original Moche designation or function. Archaeological evidence points toward a much more complicated ceremonial and political landscape. This distinction matters because ancient monuments are often given names long after their original meanings have disappeared. A modern label can make something seem understood when it is actually only partially understood. The Moche left no surviving written explanation saying, in simple terms, what every room, platform, staircase, or ritual space was intended to accomplish. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct meaning from fragments: a ceramic vessel, a damaged mural, a burial, a foundation, a layer of ash, a human bone, a cluster of bricks bearing the same mark. Each piece adds another line to an incomplete story, and some discoveries have raised unsettling possibilities. Moche artistic scenes repeatedly depict warfare, captives, ritual bloodletting, and human sacrifice. Archaeological evidence from several Moche sites supports the conclusion that ritual violence did occur, but the precise circumstances remain debated. Were sacrifices performed only during moments of political crisis? Were they associated with rainfall, drought, or agricultural cycles? Were captives selected through warfare? Did ritual violence reinforce the authority of elites? Or did different ceremonies serve different purposes? The evidence does not provide one simple answer. This uncertainty has also encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some fringe theories have portrayed the Moche as possessing hidden technologies, secret knowledge, or elaborate practices whose purposes have been deliberately obscured. There is no compelling archaeological evidence for such claims. The more grounded mystery is arguably more fascinating. The Moche accomplished extraordinary feats without the technologies that modern observers sometimes assume would be necessary. Their monumental architecture, irrigation systems, ceramics, metallurgy, and artistic traditions demonstrate sophisticated knowledge developed within their own cultural world. Nothing supernatural is required to explain Huaca del Sol, but much remains to be explained. Perhaps the greatest unanswered question concerns the people themselves. What did the ordinary inhabitants of this city think when they looked toward the enormous Huaca? Did they see the dwelling place of divine powers, the visible authority of their rulers, a sacred mountain protecting the valley, or something whose meaning changed depending on the ceremony, season, or person standing before it? We can reconstruct dimensions. We can identify construction phases. We can analyze materials. We can compare artistic representations. But we cannot easily reconstruct the emotion attached to the monument. That part of the past has almost completely disappeared. Today, wind moves across the dry valley. The adobe walls stand in broken tiers, their surfaces marked by centuries of erosion and human interference. The river that once helped destroy the monument has changed course, while the civilization that built it has become a subject of archaeological investigation. Yet the Huaca remains. Millions of bricks still occupy the landscape. Some were placed by hands whose identities are unknown. Others may preserve marks left by organized labor groups more than 1,000 years ago. And beneath the surviving earth, there may still be structures, objects, burials, and fragments waiting to be documented. Huaca del Sol therefore leaves us with a quiet uncertainty. We know enough to recognize the remarkable sophistication of the Moche, yet not enough to reconstruct every purpose behind their greatest monument. Perhaps the missing answers are not hidden in some impossible secret, but scattered patiently through the earth, waiting for future excavations to reveal what remains of a world whose builders are gone, while their immense creation continues to watch over the valley. From the immense adobe terraces of Huaca del Sol, our journey now moves across the ocean and back into the prehistoric landscapes of southern Europe, where another monument was built not from millions of mud bricks, but from carefully arranged stone. On the outskirts of Valencina de la Concepcion, near Seville, Spain, the landscape appears deceptively ordinary. Fields, roads, and modern buildings surround a low archaeological mound. Yet, beneath that earth lies a passage extending deep into the ground, leading toward a small circular chamber constructed thousands of years ago. This is the Dolmen de la Pastora. Its entrance does not rise dramatically into the sky. It descends. A narrow corridor stretches for more than 45 meters before reaching a chamber only about 2.5 meters across. Large stones form the passage, while the chamber was built with slate slabs and masonry arranged into a false dome. Above it all once stood a great earthen mound, carefully constructed in concentric layers, reaching roughly 85 meters in diameter. The monument was discovered in 1860, and from the beginning, its unusual architecture attracted attention. Because this was not simply a burial pit, it was a carefully engineered journey into darkness. The Dolmen de la Pastora belongs to the enormous prehistoric archaeological landscape of Valencina, an area covering more than 400 hectares and representing one of the largest known settlements in Western Europe associated with the Copper Age. During roughly the 3rd millennium BC, this region appears to have been a major economic, social, and ritual center. Around the settlement stood a broad belt of monumental funerary structures. More than 10 dolmens have been identified in the wider Valencina landscape, many belonging to the Tholos tradition, monuments combining a passage with a circular chamber. The concentration and scale of these structures suggest that the people living here were capable of organizing substantial communal labor and maintaining elaborate funerary traditions. But La Pastora possesses a feature that immediately separates it from many other prehistoric monuments in the region. Its entrance faces the setting sun. That is unusual. Many megalithic monuments in Andalusia are oriented toward sunrise. La Pastora points in the opposite direction, toward the western horizon. The official archaeological documentation specifically identifies this orientation as one of the monument's distinctive characteristics. Was this deliberate? Almost certainly, the orientation was intentional in some sense. The builders carefully selected the direction of a corridor more than 45 meters long. Such precision makes an accidental alignment difficult to dismiss, but intention does not automatically reveal meaning. A western entrance could have had symbolic significance connected with death, darkness, or the setting sun. Perhaps the setting sun represented a transition, just as the deceased were believed to pass from one state of existence into another. Or perhaps the explanation was more practical. Could the builders have selected the location because of the surrounding landscape? Could seasonal sunlight have entered the passage in a particular way? Could the orientation have been connected to a ritual calendar now completely lost? These possibilities remain difficult to separate because the people who built La Pastora left no written explanation of their beliefs. We can measure the monument. We can reconstruct its architecture. We can identify its building materials. But the meaning behind its direction remains partly inaccessible. And that is where the quiet mystery begins. Imagine entering the corridor thousands of years ago. The daylight behind you would gradually disappear. The passage narrows the world into a single direction. Stone walls rise on either side. The floor carries you forward, deeper into the earth. Along the route, internal doorways divide the corridor into 4 sections, each separated by stone jambs and lintels. Above, large slabs span portions of the passage. This was not an accidental accumulation of stones. It was architecture designed to control movement. One step at a time, one threshold at a time, and finally the corridor reaches the circular chamber. The space is surprisingly small compared with the enormous mound surrounding it. Why devote so much labor to creating such a narrow route toward such a confined destination? The conventional explanation is funerary and ceremonial. La Pastora formed part of a prehistoric necropolis associated with the large Copper Age settlement at Valencina. The monumental tombs likely played important roles in mortuary practices and collective memory. Archaeological evidence across the Valencina site reveals a complex society involved in agriculture, animal husbandry, craft production, exchange, ritual activity, and burial traditions. Yet even this explanation leaves something unresolved. Who was allowed to enter? Was the corridor used repeatedly? Were ceremonies conducted at the entrance, within the passage, or inside the chamber? Was the monument intended for one individual, a family, a social group, or a broader community? The answers are not always clear. The architecture itself suggests controlled access. A passage divided by multiple thresholds creates a progression from the ordinary landscape into an increasingly restricted space. Whether that restriction was symbolic, practical, or both is difficult to determine. And the mound adds another layer. The tomb was not simply buried beneath a pile of earth. The official archaeological description indicates that the tumulus itself appears carefully planned, with internal rings composed of smaller stones and earth. Its enormous diameter transformed the tomb into a visible feature of the surrounding landscape. The dead were therefore placed inside the earth, but their monument was designed to remain visible above it. Perhaps this was a way of anchoring memory. Perhaps the mound marked territory. Perhaps it served as a statement of social identity. Or perhaps the monument had several meanings simultaneously. That possibility becomes especially interesting when we consider the wider Valencina settlement. The site was not merely a cemetery. Excavations have revealed habitation areas, silos, pits, ditches, and other structures associated with productive activities. The archaeological zone extends across an enormous area, indicating a community of considerable scale and organization. So, La Pastora existed within a living landscape. People cultivated land. Animals were raised. Goods were produced. Communities gathered. And somewhere within that same world, monumental passages were constructed for the dead. The boundary between daily life and ritual life may therefore have been much less rigid than it appears today. Some modern interpretations have pushed La Pastora toward more mysterious territory. Its unusual Western orientation has encouraged suggestions of astronomical symbolism, solar rituals, or specialized ceremonies connected with the movement of the sun. Such possibilities are not inherently impossible. Prehistoric communities clearly observed seasonal changes, and the careful orientation of monumental structures across Europe demonstrates that landscape and celestial movement could carry cultural meaning. But there is an important distinction between possibility and proof. There is no definitive evidence showing that La Pastora functioned as an astronomical instrument. Nor is there evidence that its builders possessed some forgotten technology beyond the capabilities of Copper Age societies. The more grounded interpretation is also remarkable. People without metal machinery, modern surveying equipment, or written architectural plans nevertheless designed a monumental underground structure with an unusually precise orientation and an elaborate sequence of spaces. That achievement requires no supernatural explanation. It requires organization, knowledge, tradition, and a powerful reason to build. The wider Valencina site suggests that reason was connected to a complex social and ritual world that modern archaeology is still trying to reconstruct. And then there is the question of what was originally placed inside La Pastora. The monument was disturbed long before modern archaeology developed its present methods. As with many prehistoric tombs, objects and human remains cannot always be reconstructed in their original positions with confidence. The loss of context makes interpretation more difficult. A burial object, removed from its original location, can tell us that something existed. It cannot always tell us why it was there. That distinction matters. Archaeology is often the science of recovering information from incomplete evidence. A corridor survives, but the ceremony performed within it is gone. A chamber remains, but the people who entered it have disappeared. The orientation can be measured precisely, while the belief behind that orientation may remain forever uncertain. Today, La Pastora lies quietly beneath its protective landscape. The corridor still leads toward the circular chamber. The stones still mark the route. And beyond the entrance, the western horizon remains where it was when the monument was built. Perhaps the setting sun once carried a meaning that was obvious to everyone who lived here and utterly invisible to us now. From the long, inward passage of La Pastora, the journey now moves westward across the Mediterranean, to an island where prehistoric stone architecture takes on a remarkably different form. On Minorca, under a wide Mediterranean sky, a low, elongated structure stands among dry fields and scattered vegetation. Its silhouette resembles an enormous stone boat resting on land. This is the Naveta de Tudons. The name comes from its shape. Naveta means little ship, a reference to the vessel-like appearance of the monument. But there was nothing decorative about this ancient structure. Its purpose appears to have been funerary, and its construction belongs to the Paleolithic period of Minorca, within a prehistoric tradition that produced some of the island's most distinctive stone monuments. At first glance, Naveta des Tudons seems almost simple. Large stones, layer upon layer, a narrow entrance, a compact interior. Yet the closer one looks, the more carefully engineered it becomes. The monument was constructed using large blocks of stone fitted together without mortar. Its outer walls form a long, curved structure that gradually rises toward the upper section. Inside, 2 chambers are arranged one above the other, connected by a narrow vertical opening. The lower chamber served as a burial space, while the upper chamber was also associated with funerary activity. The result is an architecture that feels strangely deliberate. Why construct a tomb in the shape of a vessel? Was the form symbolic? Was it simply a practical response to structural demands? Or did the builders see the monument as something more than a container for the dead? The first answer comes from archaeology. Naveta des Tudons is understood as a collective funerary monument. Excavations carried out in the 20th century revealed human remains belonging to numerous individuals, along with objects associated with burial practices, including pottery and personal ornaments. These discoveries transformed the structure from an architectural curiosity into something more intimate. This was a place where generations of people were brought after death. Not a palace, not a fortress, not a dwelling, a tomb. And yet its appearance makes it difficult to think of it as an ordinary burial structure. The vessel-like profile has encouraged generations of observers to see a connection with ships. The resemblance is so strong that it is easy to imagine the monument as a symbolic boat, perhaps carrying the dead toward another realm. But symbolism is difficult to prove. The people who built the Naveta left no written explanation describing what its shape meant. There is no inscription saying that the monument represented a voyage. No surviving text explaining the beliefs surrounding death. The interpretation comes from the architecture itself. And architecture can speak without words, but it does not always speak clearly. Minorca contains hundreds of prehistoric monuments, including taliots, taulas, hypostyle structures, caves, and other burial sites. Together, they reveal a society that developed distinctive architectural traditions over many centuries. The Paleolithic culture emerged within the wider prehistoric development of the Balearic Islands and continued through the first millennium BC. Minorca's monuments suggest organized communities capable of substantial collective construction, while also revealing regional traditions unlike those found elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Naveta des Tudons belongs to an earlier phase of this long development. Its exact date has been debated, but archaeological evidence generally places its construction in the 2nd millennium BC, with some estimates extending into the later part of that period. This means the monument predates the Roman conquest of the island by many centuries. It also predates the historical cultures that later recorded Minorca in written sources. The people who built the Naveta belonged to a prehistoric world whose language, social structure, and religious beliefs are largely unknown. That is where the mystery deepens. The monument survived. The civilization did not. Imagine approaching it when it was newly constructed. The stone would have been cleaner, sharper, and brighter. The surrounding landscape would have looked different. There would have been no modern roads, no fences, no signs explaining its function. Only the monument, a carefully shaped mass of stone standing against the landscape. The entrance would lead into the lower chamber, where the remains of the dead were placed. Above, another room was reached through a narrow passage. The internal arrangement suggests that burial practices were not random. Access was controlled by the architecture itself. Why 2 levels? Perhaps the chambers served different stages of funerary ritual. Perhaps different categories of remains were placed in different areas. Perhaps the upper room was associated with offerings or ceremonies. Archaeological evidence provides clues, but not a complete sequence of events. This is common with prehistoric tombs. The physical structure survives far more easily than the ritual that gave it meaning. A stone wall can remain for thousands of years. A ceremony lasts minutes. A belief can disappear in a single generation. And once the people who understood the monument are gone, archaeologists are left reconstructing an invisible world from visible remains. The collective nature of the burials raises another question. Who were these people to one another? Were they members of one extended community? Several generations of the same population? Different social groups using the same monument? The human remains provide biological information, but relationships and social identities are harder to reconstruct. There is also the question of selection. Not everyone may have been treated identically after death. Across prehistoric societies, burial practices often reflect differences in status, age, gender, occupation, or social role. At Naveta des Tudons, the evidence suggests collective burial, but the precise rules governing who entered the monument and when remain difficult to recover. This uncertainty has occasionally encouraged more imaginative interpretations. Some writers have described the Naveta as an ancient ship of the dead, suggesting that its form represents a symbolic voyage beyond life. Others have connected its orientation or proportions with astronomical observations, proposing that the monument may have been aligned with celestial events. Such ideas are intriguing, but the evidence remains insufficient to establish them as fact. There is no consensus that Naveta des Tudons functioned as an astronomical device. Nor is there evidence of some forgotten technology that would require explanations outside known prehistoric engineering. Its construction is impressive precisely because it demonstrates what skilled builders could achieve with stone, planning, experience, and organized labor. The walls were carefully fitted. The shape was deliberate. The internal spaces were structurally coherent. The monument endured. Perhaps that endurance itself tells us something about its creators. A tomb intended for collective use is also a statement about memory. The living built something for the dead, but they also built something for themselves. Every time people approached the Naveta, they were reminded of those who had come before. The monument became a fixed point in the landscape, linking generations that would never meet. In that sense, its purpose may have extended beyond burial. It preserved identity. It marked belonging. It transformed the landscape into a place where memory had a physical address. And perhaps this helps explain the unusual shape. A vessel is made to carry something from one place to another. The dead cannot physically travel across the sea, but a symbolic journey requires no water. The Naveta may have represented such a passage, or its shape may simply reflect a long architectural tradition whose original meaning has been lost. Both possibilities remain open. There is another unsettling detail. The monument looks almost familiar. Human beings recognize the outline of a boat because we have seen boats for thousands of years. When we stand before Naveta des Tudons, our minds instinctively impose that image upon the stones. But what if the builders did not see a ship at all? What if the resemblance is meaningful? Or what if we are simply projecting our own ideas onto an ancient structure? That distinction is impossible to settle through appearance alone. Archaeology must resist the temptation to turn resemblance into proof. Still, the shape remains difficult to ignore. A prehistoric tomb designed like a vessel, a place for the dead, a structure standing on an island surrounded by sea. It is easy to understand why the monument has attracted speculation. Yet, perhaps the more important mystery is not whether the Naveta was literally intended as a ship. It is why this community chose such a distinctive architectural language for death. What did they believe happened after the final breath? Did they imagine another world, a transformation, a journey, a return to the earth? Or was the monument primarily about the living, their ancestors, their lineage, and their place within a community? The stones remain silent on that point. Today, Naveta des Tudons stands among Menorca's landscape as one of the best preserved examples of its type. The surrounding world has changed almost beyond recognition, but the structure continues to preserve the outline of a society that left few written records. Inside those carefully fitted stones, human remains once rested in darkness. The stone vessel of Menorca leaves us with the image of a community carefully shaping the landscape for the dead. Now, the journey turns inland, toward the rugged highlands of central Spain, where stone served a different purpose. Here, on an exposed granite plateau surrounded by mountains, the remains of an ancient fortified settlement stretch across the summit like the foundations of a forgotten city. This is Castro de Ulaca. Located near the modern village of Villaviciosa, in the province of Avila, Ulaca occupies a commanding position in the Sierra de la Paramera. The settlement stands at roughly 1,500 meters above sea level, surrounded by open uplands and dramatic granite formations. From the hilltop, the view extends across valleys and mountain ridges, making it immediately clear why people chose this particular location. The landscape itself is defensive. Steep slopes protect much of the settlement naturally. The summit provides visibility, and the surrounding granite supplied an abundance of building material. Ulaca was one of the largest known fortified settlements associated with the Vetones, an Iron Age people who inhabited parts of central and western Iberia before the Roman conquest. Its occupation is generally placed in the later 1st millennium BC, although activity in the surrounding region extends across a much longer period. The settlement was enclosed by a substantial stone wall, but the wall is only the beginning. Inside, archaeologists have identified streets, houses, workshops, storage areas, and other structures spread across the plateau. The settlement was not simply a military outpost. It was a functioning community. At its height, Ulaca may have supported a population numbering in the thousands, although precise estimates remain uncertain. And then there are the stones that have made the site famous. Among the most intriguing is a large carved granite structure often called the Altar of Sacrifices. It is not an altar in the conventional sense of a raised table. Instead, it is a massive outcrop of granite shaped with steps, channels, and carved surfaces. A small depression near the upper section has been interpreted as a possible place associated with ritual activity. The name sounds definitive, but it is not. Archaeologists cannot simply look at a stone structure and know exactly what ceremony took place there. The interpretation as a sacrificial monument comes from its form, its location, and comparisons with other Iron Age ritual sites. Yet, the precise function remains debated. Was this truly a place where animals, or humans, were sacrificed? Was it connected with offerings? Was it used for some form of ritual purification? Or did it serve a function that modern observers have misunderstood entirely? The uncertainty is important. Ulaca belonged to a society whose religious practices were only partially recorded by outsiders. Ancient Roman and Greek authors occasionally described the peoples of Iberia, but their accounts were written from external perspectives and often reflected the assumptions of Mediterranean writers. The people of Ulaca left no surviving written explanation of their own rituals. Their religion must therefore be reconstructed from archaeology, and archaeology can reveal a surprising amount. At Ulaca, The settlement's architecture suggests that ritual was not completely separated from ordinary life. Religious structures existed alongside houses, streets, and communal spaces. That arrangement raises a deeper question. Was the entire settlement organized around a sacred landscape? Or were ritual places simply part of everyday community life? The answer may lie partly in the geography. Ulaca is surrounded by natural granite formations, caves, slopes, and elevated viewpoints. For prehistoric communities, landscapes were not necessarily neutral spaces. Particular rocks, springs, mountains, or horizons could carry meanings that left no physical inscription. A modern visitor sees geology. The people who lived here may have seen something else. Perhaps a mountain had an identity. Perhaps a rock formation was associated with a deity. Perhaps certain locations were considered boundaries between different worlds. We cannot know, but the architecture suggests that the natural landscape mattered. One of the site's most intriguing features is a large granite structure known as the Torreon, or tower. Its exact purpose is uncertain, but its massive construction demonstrates the defensive and monumental character of the settlement. Ulaca's walls were built from large granite blocks, creating a perimeter that followed the natural contours of the hill. The builders did not simply place a rectangular fortress on top of the mountain. They adapted the settlement to the terrain. Natural cliffs became defensive barriers. Granite outcrops became architectural elements. Paths followed the contours of the hill. The entire settlement seems to have been designed as an interaction between human construction and the mountain itself. That relationship becomes even more interesting when considering the settlement's eventual disappearance. During the 2nd century BC and later, Rome expanded into central Iberia. The peoples of the region were gradually drawn into conflict with Roman power. The Vettones were not isolated from these events. Roman expansion transformed their political and economic world. Some settlements were abandoned, reorganized, or incorporated into new systems of control. Ulaca's occupation eventually declined, and the settlement was abandoned. The exact circumstances remain difficult to reconstruct. Was the community destroyed? Was it gradually relocated? Did political changes make the highland settlement unnecessary? Did economic transformation undermine its importance? The stones do not provide a simple answer. This uncertainty has contributed to the site's mysterious reputation. Modern discussions sometimes portray Ulaca as a center of secret Celtic or pre-Roman knowledge, with claims involving astronomical alignments, hidden rituals, and mysterious ceremonies. Some interpretations focus particularly on the site's orientation toward the surrounding mountains and the possibility that certain structures were connected with celestial observations. Such possibilities are worth examining carefully. Ancient societies certainly observed the sky. Seasonal cycles mattered for agriculture, animal husbandry, travel, and ritual. But an apparent alignment does not automatically prove astronomical intention. The challenge is distinguishing deliberate design from coincidence. At Ulaca, the evidence remains insufficient to establish that the settlement functioned as an elaborate astronomical observatory. The more firmly supported interpretation is that it was a major fortified community whose inhabitants possessed complex social organization, skilled stoneworking traditions, and religious practices that remain only partially understood. Yet, even this conventional picture is remarkable. Consider the labor required to build the walls. Consider the extraction and movement of granite. Consider the planning necessary to organize streets, homes, defensive structures, and communal areas across a mountain plateau. These were not isolated families improvising shelters. This was a society capable of collective construction on a significant scale. And perhaps that is where the real mystery begins. Who held authority here? Was Ulaca governed by a single elite, a council of local leaders, warrior families, religious specialists, or some combination of these groups. The archaeological evidence can identify differences in buildings and material wealth, but it cannot always reconstruct the political system with confidence. The same problem appears when examining the settlement's ritual spaces. If the so-called altar of sacrifices was truly ceremonial, who controlled it? Who was permitted to approach? Were rituals performed publicly before the community or privately by specialists? Did ceremonies mark seasonal events, political transitions, military victories, funerary occasions, or something else? Each possibility changes how we understand the settlement. A ritual monument is not merely a stone object. It tells us something about power. Someone decided where it belonged. Someone decided who could use it. Someone taught others what it meant. And when that chain of knowledge disappeared, the monument became an archaeological puzzle. Today, the granite remains of Ulaca are exposed beneath the open sky. The walls trace the shape of streets that once carried people through the settlement. The houses have collapsed into foundations. The defensive perimeter survives in fragments. The ritual stones remain fixed in place, but the ceremonies that once gave them meaning have vanished. Wind moves across the plateau where voices once filled the streets. The mountains remain almost unchanged. That continuity is perhaps the most haunting feature of Ulaca. The people disappeared. Their political world disappeared. Their language and beliefs largely disappeared. But the landscape remained. Standing among the granite, it becomes possible to sense how easily a place can outlive the civilization that created it. A wall may survive while the reason for building it is forgotten. A carved stone may remain visible for thousands of years, while the ritual performed upon it becomes impossible to reconstruct. And somewhere between the practical fortress and the sacred mountain lies the unresolved story of Ulaca. Perhaps its stones were primarily defensive. Perhaps its ritual spaces reveal a religious world far more complex than surviving evidence allows us to see. Perhaps future excavations will uncover another structure, inscription, burial, or object that changes the interpretation entirely. The granite slopes of Ulaca leave us with a landscape shaped by walls, ritual stones, and unanswered questions. But now the journey moves far beyond the mountains of Iberia, across the Atlantic to central Mexico, where an ancient city was built on an astonishing scale. There, beneath the monumental avenue of Teotihuacan, archaeologists discovered something unexpectedly elusive. A narrow tunnel carved deep into the earth, sealed for centuries, and containing traces of a substance that seemed almost impossible to find in such a place. Liquid mercury. The discovery transformed an already mysterious city into an even more intriguing archaeological puzzle. Teotihuacan lies roughly 50 kilometers northeast of modern Mexico City. At its height, between roughly AD 100 and 550, it was one of the largest cities in the ancient Americas. Its immense pyramids, broad avenues, apartment compounds, temples, and carefully planned urban grid reveal a civilization capable of extraordinary organization. Yet, the identity of the people who built Teotihuacan remains uncertain. The city was already centuries old when the Aztecs encountered its ruins and gave it the name Teotihuacan, often translated as the place where the gods were created. The original name used by its inhabitants is unknown, and beneath this monumental city, archaeologists found something hidden. A tunnel beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent was discovered in 2003 after heavy rainfall caused a depression to appear near the pyramid. Excavations eventually revealed a long underground passage leading toward the center of the complex. The tunnel had been intentionally sealed. Inside, archaeologists encountered thousands of objects: stone ornaments, shells, pottery, sculpted figures, pyrite spheres, and other offerings. The passage appeared to have been carefully prepared before being closed. But then came the mercury. Pools and traces of liquid mercury were identified near the end of the tunnel. For archaeologists, this was an extraordinary discovery. Mercury is naturally occurring, but liquid mercury is rare in archaeological contexts. It was especially significant here because mercury has reflective, shimmering properties and can appear almost supernatural when seen moving across a dark surface. Yet there is no need to invoke anything beyond ancient knowledge to explain its presence. The Teotihuacanos may have obtained mercury from cinnabar, a bright red mineral containing mercury sulfide. Cinnabar was known and used by ancient peoples in Mesoamerica, often as a pigment and funerary substance. But why place liquid mercury deep inside a tunnel? That is where certainty begins to fade. The tunnel itself appears to have been deliberately constructed beneath one of Teotihuacan's most important ceremonial areas. Its orientation and internal features suggest that it was not simply a drainage channel or practical underground passage. It seems to have had ritual significance. But ritual significance can take many forms. Perhaps the tunnel represented a journey into an underworld. Perhaps it was connected with ideas about water, fertility, death, or transformation. Perhaps the reflective surface of Mercury was intended to evoke celestial bodies or a sacred body of water. The evidence does not provide a single definitive explanation. And the mystery becomes even more interesting when we consider the tunnel's contents. The archaeologists who excavated it found thousands of offerings distributed along its length. Greenstone objects, shells from distant regions, jaguar remains, pottery, rubber balls, carved stone figures, and other materials were deposited within the passage. This was not a random collection. It was an intentional accumulation. Someone designed the ritual. Someone selected the objects. Someone decided where they should be placed. And eventually, someone closed the tunnel. The passage may therefore have represented a sacred landscape compressed beneath the city, a symbolic journey from the world of the living into a hidden realm. Such interpretations fit broader Mesoamerican religious traditions, in which caves, mountains, springs, and underground spaces could be associated with origins, fertility, ancestors, and supernatural forces. Teotihuacan itself appears to have been built around powerful cosmological ideas. The Pyramid of the Sun stands near a natural cave or tunnel system, and later cultures associated caves and mountains with sacred origins. Whether the original inhabitants of Teotihuacan understood these spaces in exactly the same way remains uncertain. Still, the repeated connection between architecture, mountains, caves, and ritual suggests that the subterranean world was not merely geological. It could be sacred. The mercury adds another layer. Mercury is reflective. It moves. It separates into droplets. Under certain conditions, it appears almost alive. Imagine entering the tunnel by torchlight thousands of years ago. The passage is narrow. The stone walls close around you. The light flickers across offerings deliberately arranged along the floor. And then, somewhere ahead, the darkness reflects back at you through a pool of shining metal. Whatever the original intention, the visual effect must have been remarkable. This has led some writers to propose that the mercury represented a symbolic lake or river of the underworld. Others have suggested that it may have been associated with stars, celestial reflections, or a supernatural boundary between worlds. Some fringe theories go much further, treating the mercury as evidence of advanced technology or an ancient understanding of properties supposedly beyond the capabilities of the period. There is no credible archaeological evidence requiring such explanations. Ancient peoples did not need modern technology to recognize that mercury was unusual. They could observe its reflective qualities directly. They could collect and manipulate it. and they could attach symbolic meaning to its appearance. The real question is therefore not how an ancient civilization could possibly have known about Mercury. It is why they considered Mercury appropriate for this particular sacred environment. That question remains open. The tunnel's construction itself presents another puzzle. Excavators found that the passage had been deliberately sealed and protected. The effort required to construct it beneath a major ceremonial complex would have been considerable. Why build something underground if the intention was eventually to close it? Perhaps the act of sealing was itself part of the ritual. A sacred deposit does not necessarily need to remain accessible. In many ancient traditions, the act of hiding an offering could be as important as displaying it. The tunnel may have been designed as a place where the city communicated with forces believed to exist beneath the visible world. And there is something deeply human about that idea. Cities rise above the ground. Tunnels descend below it. One represents public life. The other creates a hidden space where only certain people may enter. At Teotihuacan, these two worlds were connected. The city above was enormous, ordered, and visible. The tunnel below was narrow, dark, and concealed. The contrast may not have been accidental. It may have reflected a cosmology in which the visible city depended upon an invisible world beneath it. The identity of the people responsible for this elaborate ritual remains another unresolved problem. Teotihuacan was ethnically and culturally diverse, and scholars continue to debate its political organization. No ruler's name has been securely identified in the way that later Maya inscriptions sometimes identify kings. There are monumental images. There are artifacts. There are architectural patterns. But the voices of the city's rulers remain largely silent. That silence makes interpretation especially difficult. We can study the tunnel's physical evidence, but we cannot ask its builders what the Mercury meant. Perhaps future discoveries will provide the missing context. Maybe another tunnel contains related offerings. Maybe an inscription elsewhere will reveal a ritual tradition. Maybe the distribution of Mercury across the site will show that it was associated with a particular deity or ceremony. For now, archaeologists can establish what is physically present far more confidently than what it symbolized. The tunnel contained Mercury. It contained thousands of offerings. It was deliberately constructed. It was eventually sealed. Those facts are firm. Everything beyond them becomes interpretation, and perhaps that distinction is what makes the discovery so compelling. The mystery does not require claims of lost technology or visitors from another world. The archaeological evidence already tells us that the inhabitants of Teotihuacan created a ritual environment whose meaning has partly disappeared. Deep beneath the monumental city, they left a message in stone, mineral, shell, and metal. Then they closed the door. Centuries passed. The city fell silent. Its builders disappeared. And the tunnel remained hidden beneath the earth until modern excavations reopened a space that had not seen the outside world for generations beyond counting. The liquid mercury still glimmers in the archaeological record like a fragment of an unfinished sentence. Perhaps it represented water. Perhaps the underworld. Perhaps the night sky. Perhaps something else entirely. Whatever its meaning, the substance tells us that the people of Teotihuacan saw significance in materials that modern observers might overlook. And somewhere beneath the ancient city there may still be another sealed passage, another offering, or another carefully hidden object waiting to reveal what the mercury was meant to signify, and why this mysterious city chose to place such a strange and reflective substance so deep within the earth. The sealed tunnel at Teotihuacan leaves us with an image of hidden worlds beneath monumental cities. Now, the journey returns to Europe, crossing the Atlantic once more and moving north into the granite landscapes of northeastern Scotland. Here, among rolling farmland and exposed hills, a low, grassy ridge rises above the surrounding landscape. At first, it looks almost natural. Only closer inspection reveals traces of stonework, defensive banks, and the remains of an ancient settlement. This is Dunnideer Hillfort. Located in Aberdeenshire, near the village of Inch, Dunnideer occupies a prominent hill overlooking the surrounding countryside. The position is modest compared with the great citadels of the ancient world, but its elevation gives it an important advantage. From the summit, the landscape opens in every direction. A settlement here could see approaching movement long before someone reached the hill. And perhaps that was precisely the point. Dunnideer belongs to the tradition of Scottish hill forts, fortified settlements constructed on naturally defensible elevations during prehistoric and early historic periods. The site contains traces of multiple phases of occupation, including substantial defensive structures. But the hill has an unusual feature. At its summit are the remains of a vitrified fort. Some of the stones appear to have been exposed to temperatures intense enough to partially melt them, fusing fragments of rock together into a glass-like mass. This is vitrification, and it has fascinated archaeologists for generations. How does stone melt on a hilltop? Why would anyone deliberately create such intense heat within a defensive wall? And, perhaps most importantly, was the vitrification intentional? The conventional explanation is connected with fire. Many prehistoric and early historic hill forts across Scotland and other parts of northern Europe contain vitrified stone. In some cases, researchers have suggested that timber-laced defensive walls were deliberately burned. When wooden beams embedded within stone ramparts caught fire, temperatures could become high enough to partially fuse the surrounding rocks. Another possibility is destruction by enemy attack. A fort under siege could be set ablaze. If timber structures were incorporated into the walls, the resulting fire might have reached extreme temperatures. But there is a problem. Ordinary burning is not always sufficient to explain extensive vitrification. Temperatures required to melt or fuse many types of rock can exceed what a normal open-air fire would produce. That has led researchers to investigate how these ancient structures might have burned, and whether the vitrification was accidental, deliberate, or the result of repeated destruction. Dunnideer, therefore, becomes part of a much larger archaeological mystery. Across Scotland, vitrified forts occur in different environments and periods, suggesting that no single explanation necessarily applies to every site. At some locations, the vitrification is limited. At others, large quantities of stone appear fused together. The evidence may represent several different processes rather than one universal method. Dunnideer's own history is complicated. The hill appears to have been occupied and modified over long periods, with prehistoric activity followed by later use. The surviving remains have been altered by erosion, agriculture, and centuries of exposure. This makes it difficult to reconstruct exactly what the original fort looked like. The defensive walls have collapsed. Timber elements have disappeared. Organic materials have decayed. What remains is mostly stone and earth. But those fragments are enough to show that the hill was not simply a temporary refuge. It was a constructed environment. The builders selected the summit, shaped its defenses, and transformed the natural hill into a fortified place. The location would have been strategically valuable. The surrounding landscape contains fertile agricultural areas, and the hill provides broad visibility. A fortified settlement could serve multiple functions. It could protect inhabitants. It could control movement. It could display the authority of a local group. It could provide refuge during conflict, or it could serve as a central gathering place for a wider community. The word fort sometimes creates a misleading impression. A hill fort was not necessarily occupied by soldiers in the modern sense. Many were settlements where ordinary domestic life continued behind defensive boundaries. Houses stood inside. Animals may have been kept nearby. Food was stored. Craft activities took place. People lived, worked, raised children, and died there. The walls therefore represented more than protection. They also represented identity. A community that built a fort was physically marking its relationship with the landscape. At Dunnideer, however, the vitrified stone complicates this picture. If the wall was burned deliberately, then destruction may have been part of the site's history. Perhaps the fort was attacked. Perhaps it was intentionally dismantled. Perhaps the fire had a ritual dimension. Or perhaps vitrification was simply an unintended consequence of violent conflict. There is no universally accepted answer. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative ideas. Some fringe interpretations have proposed that vitrified forts were deliberately subjected to advanced, high-temperature techniques unknown to modern archaeology. Others have suggested that the fused stone served some kind of ritual or technological purpose. Such claims are difficult to support. There is no strong evidence that the builders possessed a mysterious technology capable of producing controlled industrial-scale temperatures. Ancient people were capable of intense fires, however. Wood, charcoal, airflow, enclosed spaces, and carefully arranged materials can produce surprisingly high temperatures. The challenge is reconstructing the exact conditions. That is where experimental archaeology becomes important. Researchers have conducted experiments with timber-laced stone structures to determine whether large-scale fires could generate sufficient heat to vitrify rock. The results have shown that intense burning can indeed produce fused material under certain conditions. But experiments also reveal how difficult it can be to reproduce the precise patterns observed at ancient forts. A fire hot enough to vitrify stone is not necessarily a fire that happened naturally. It requires conditions: fuel, oxygen, duration, and perhaps deliberate construction. At Dunnideer, the missing timber makes the original process impossible to observe directly. Only its consequences survive. That makes the vitrified stone almost like a fossil of a fire. The flame is gone. The smoke is gone. The people who watched it are gone. Only the transformed rock remains. And there is something strangely evocative about that. Stone normally represents permanence. Fire represents destruction. At Dunnideer, the two have become physically connected. A wall designed to endure was altered by an event powerful enough to change the material itself. What happened on that hill? Was it an attack? A deliberate burning of an abandoned settlement? A ritual closing of the fort? Or simply an uncontrolled fire that transformed the defenses by accident? The archaeological evidence does not allow a confident final answer. And perhaps the mystery extends beyond the fire. Who controlled Dunnideer? What was its relationship with neighboring settlements? Was the hill a permanent center or a refuge? How did the community respond to changing political conditions? The fort's long history suggests that the hill remained meaningful over generations, but the precise reasons for its continued importance are difficult to reconstruct. Later, historical traditions connect Dunnideer with the early medieval period and with local political figures, but separating historical memory from much older archaeological evidence requires caution. The hill itself does not explain where one period ends and another begins. It simply preserves layers: prehistoric defenses, later occupation, ruined stonework, grass growing over ancient walls. Each generation altered the summit, leaving behind fragments that overlapped like pages in a damaged manuscript. Today, Dunnideer is quiet. The modern landscape stretches around it. Cattle move through nearby fields. Wind crosses the summit. The surviving stones no longer look threatening. Yet, beneath the grass are the traces of a place once important enough to defend. And among those stones are fragments that appear to have been transformed by extraordinary heat. Perhaps future research will clarify how the vitrification occurred. Perhaps excavations will reveal additional structures, datable materials, or evidence of destruction that could finally place the burning event within a precise historical context. Or perhaps the hill will continue to offer only fragments. A fused stone here, a collapsed wall there, a faint outline beneath the grass. Enough evidence to know that something happened, but not enough to reconstruct exactly why. The fire has disappeared. The builders have disappeared. The settlement has disappeared. Only the hill remains, holding the memory of a community whose walls were once meant to protect them, and whose stones may have been transformed by the very force that ultimately brought those defenses to an end. And standing above the quiet landscape, one question remains. Was Dunnideer's vitrified stone the accidental scar of an ancient conflict, the deliberate result of construction and fire, or the surviving trace of a ritual whose meaning has not yet been recovered? The vitrified stones of Dunnideer leave us with an image of fire permanently trapped inside rock. From the windswept hills of Scotland, the journey now turns toward the ancient landscapes of the Indian subcontinent, where another mystery survives not in a fortress wall, but in a sequence of stone platforms associated with one of South Asia's most important Buddhist archaeological sites. Near Taxila, in modern-day Pakistan, the remains of Dharamrajika rise from the dry landscape of the ancient Gandharan region. Weathered stone, broken foundations, circular structures, and fragments of monasteries spread across the site, revealing a place that once connected religion, pilgrimage, scholarship, and political power. At first glance, Dharamrajika appears to be a conventional Buddhist archaeological complex. But beneath that familiar description lies a much older and more complicated story. The site is associated primarily with the Buddhist period of ancient Taxila, particularly from around the 3rd century BC onward. Yet, the wider landscape had already been inhabited for centuries, and archaeological evidence shows that human activity around Taxila extends deep into prehistory. This raises an intriguing possibility. Were some of the stone platforms beneath or around the later Buddhist complex inherited from earlier traditions? And if so, what did they mean before Buddhism transformed the landscape? The name Dharamrajika is associated with the Buddhist tradition and is generally understood as referring to the Great Wheel or Great Dharma King, although historical interpretations of the name vary. The site's most prominent monument is a massive stupa complex, traditionally associated with Emperor Ashoka, who ruled much of the Mauryan Empire during the 3rd century BC. According to Buddhist tradition, Ashoka became a major patron of Buddhism and is credited with constructing or supporting stupas across his realm. Dharamrajika is often connected with that period. But archaeology is more cautious than tradition. The monument developed over time. It was enlarged, modified, rebuilt, surrounded by additional structures. The complex, therefore, cannot be understood as a single construction event. It is a layered landscape. And somewhere within those layers are the remains of earlier architectural traditions. The stone platforms are particularly intriguing because platforms have an obvious practical function. Yet, prehistoric monumental platforms can also have ceremonial meanings. A raised surface separates something from the ground. It makes an object visible. It creates a boundary. It can support a structure, an altar, a monument, or a gathering place. But without the original context, a platform can become an archaeological riddle. Why was it raised? Who was allowed to stand upon it? What was placed there? Was it temporary, permanent, sacred, administrative, or simply architectural? At Dharamrajika, later Buddhist structures provide a powerful interpretive framework, but they can also make it difficult to see the landscape that existed before them. Ancient sites are rarely frozen at one moment in time. They accumulate. One generation builds, another modifies, another repurposes. A sacred place may become a political center. A political center may become a pilgrimage destination. A structure may survive long after its original purpose has been forgotten. Taxila is an extraordinary example of this process. The ancient city existed at a crossroads linking South Asia with Central Asia and the wider regions of the Iranian plateau. Its location helped make it an important center of commerce and cultural exchange. Greek influence arrived after the campaigns of Alexander the Great. Later came Indo-Greek rulers, the Scythians, the Parthians, and the Kushans. Each period left traces. Dharamrajika therefore existed within a landscape where cultures met, overlapped, and transformed one another. This makes its stone architecture particularly difficult to interpret. A structure that looks unfamiliar today may once have been completely ordinary within a particular cultural tradition, and a monument that seems obviously religious may have had several functions at once. The Buddhist stupa itself offers a useful comparison. To modern eyes, it can appear to be a simple mound or dome, but within Buddhist tradition, the stupa is a sacred monument associated with relics, memory, devotion, and the presence of the Buddha or revered individuals. Its meaning comes not only from its shape, but from the rituals performed around it. Pilgrims could walk around the monument in a prescribed direction. Offerings could be placed nearby. Relics could be enclosed within. The structure became a physical focus for memory and devotion. At Dharamrajika, archaeological excavations have revealed numerous stupas, monasteries, chapels, and associated structures surrounding the main monument. This tells us that the complex evolved into a major religious center, but it does not automatically explain every earlier stone feature. Some modern interpretations have suggested that unusual platforms or architectural remnants at Taxila may preserve memories of even older ceremonial traditions. Others have connected them with pre-Buddhist ritual practices. These ideas are plausible enough to investigate but difficult to prove. The strongest evidence comes from stratigraphy, construction materials, dating, and the relationship between different architectural layers. Without secure dating, an unusual platform can easily be assigned to the wrong period. That is one of archaeology's most persistent problems. A stone does not carry its date on its surface. Its meaning depends upon where it was found, and where it was found depends upon everything built around it afterward. This becomes especially important at sites that remained occupied for centuries. Taxila is not one monument. It is a palimpsest. The past has been written over the past, and Dharamrajika is one of the places where those layers become visible. The most widely accepted explanation for the later complex is religious. It was a Buddhist sacred center associated with stupas, monasteries, relics, and pilgrimage. There is no compelling reason to reject that interpretation. But the deeper question concerns the landscape before that religious transformation. What stood here before the Buddhist structures? Were there local sacred places that were incorporated into the new religious landscape? Did Buddhist builders deliberately choose a location that already carried significance? Ancient religions often did not simply erase earlier sacred geography. They sometimes adopted it. A spring could remain sacred. A hill could retain its importance. A burial place could be transformed. A location associated with an earlier tradition could acquire a new interpretation. If something similar occurred at Dharamrajika, the stone platforms may represent fragments of a much older story. Yet, the evidence is not sufficient to reconstruct that story with confidence. And this is where speculation begins. Some fringe theories have portrayed Taxila as evidence of civilizations possessing knowledge far beyond their historical context, sometimes linking its architecture with lost technologies, unknown builders, or unexplained astronomical systems. There is no strong archaeological evidence requiring such explanations. The sophisticated architecture of Taxila can be understood within the technological and cultural capabilities of ancient South Asia. Stoneworking, brickmaking, masonry, geometry, and large-scale construction were all well within the abilities of societies that built major urban and religious centers. The mystery is not how they could have built it. The mystery is what every structure meant to the people who used it. That distinction matters. A platform may look mysterious because we have forgotten its function, not because its builders possessed impossible knowledge. Consider the wider landscape. Taxila was a meeting point between cultural traditions. Greek architectural forms existed alongside South Asian religious traditions. Iranian influences entered the region. Buddhist institutions developed within a multicultural environment. Could the stone platforms therefore represent an interaction of traditions rather than a single architectural system? Perhaps, but again, the evidence must be handled carefully. A resemblance between two structures does not necessarily prove contact. A shared architectural technique may have developed independently, and a later structure may imitate an earlier form for reasons that are now invisible. This uncertainty is precisely what makes Dharamrajika valuable. The site does not provide one clean story. It provides layers. Beneath the Buddhist monuments lies an older landscape. Around the main stupa are traces of later construction. Across the wider Taxila Valley are settlements and archaeological remains belonging to different periods. Together, they reveal how sacred places can accumulate meaning over centuries. Today, the ruins of Dharamrajika are quiet. The monasteries have lost their roofs. The stupas stand weathered. The stone foundations mark rooms where people once prayed, studied, worked, and lived. The platforms remain without the voices that once explained them. Perhaps they were ritual spaces. Perhaps they supported structures now completely lost. Perhaps some belonged to earlier traditions that were later absorbed into the Buddhist landscape. Or perhaps their original purpose was more ordinary than modern observers imagine. The earth may still contain the evidence needed to distinguish these possibilities. A buried layer, a datable object, a forgotten foundation, a fragment of inscription. Something small enough to be overlooked, yet significant enough to change the interpretation of an entire structure. And that is the quiet mystery of Dharamrajika. The layered stones of Dharamrajika leave us with the image of a place rebuilt again and again, each generation leaving its own mark while earlier meanings slowly disappear beneath the next. From the ancient crossroads of Taxila, our journey now returns to the Americas, to the highlands of central Mexico, where another monumental settlement rises from a very different landscape. On a rocky ridge in the state of Zacatecas, surrounded by dry valleys and distant mountains, enormous terraces and stone walls climb across the hillside. Long stairways lead upward. Thick defensive walls follow the contours of the terrain. At the summit, massive structures overlook the surrounding country. This is La Quemada. The name means the burned place, a modern description inspired by the site's appearance and traces of burning. But the people who built this extraordinary settlement left no clear written explanation of what the place was originally called. That absence is important, because La Quemada is one of those archaeological sites where the architecture is visible, but the identity of its builders remains much less certain. The settlement was occupied for centuries, broadly between about AD 300 and 900, although the chronology is complex and different parts of the site were used at different times. It developed into a substantial ceremonial and fortified center within a region that connected several cultural zones of ancient Mesoamerica. Its position was not accidental. La Quemada sits on a prominent hill overlooking a broad landscape. From the higher terraces, the surrounding valleys can be seen for considerable distances. Visibility was power. A settlement in this position could monitor movement through the region, protect important routes, and perhaps control access to valuable resources. But was La Quemada primarily a fortress? That question has occupied researchers for decades. Its walls certainly look defensive. The site contains terraces, walls, stairways, platforms, and monumental structures arranged across the hillside. Some areas appear deliberately designed to restrict movement, creating controlled approaches toward the upper sections. Yet, defensive architecture does not necessarily mean the entire settlement was created for warfare. The same walls that protect a city can also define sacred spaces. The same elevated platform can serve political, ceremonial, and practical functions. La Quemada may have combined all three. At the heart of the complex is the structure known as the Hall of Columns, one of the site's most recognizable features. Large stone columns once supported a substantial roof, creating an enclosed space unlike the open pyramidal platforms elsewhere in Mesoamerica. What happened inside? That remains uncertain. It may have been a ceremonial gathering place, a political hall, a residence for elites, or a structure serving several purposes over time. The architecture provides clues, but no surviving inscription tells us exactly how the space was used. And that uncertainty becomes even more significant when considering the identity of the people who built La Quemada. For many years, the site was associated with the legendary Chichimeca peoples mentioned in later historical traditions. Some older interpretations also connected La Quemada with the Toltecs or other well-known Mesoamerican civilizations. Modern archaeology is far more cautious. The site appears to have developed within a local cultural tradition that interacted with broader Mesoamerican networks. Its builders were not necessarily members of a famous civilization known from written history. They may have belonged to communities whose names have disappeared. Their material culture survives. Their architecture survives. But their own description of themselves does not. This creates one of the site's most compelling mysteries. How does a civilization become archaeologically visible while remaining historically anonymous? At La Quemada, the answer is written in stone. The builders organized labor on a large scale. They moved heavy materials. They constructed terraces into the hillside. They planned monumental buildings. They created controlled routes through the settlement. They developed a fortified landscape capable of supporting a substantial community. Yet, we do not know with certainty what they called themselves. We do not know exactly which political system governed the settlement. And we do not know why this particular location became so important. One possibility is trade. La Quemada occupies a strategic position near routes connecting northern and central regions of Mesoamerica. Archaeological evidence indicates that the broader area participated in networks of long-distance exchange. The site may therefore have served as a regional center, controlling movement and trade through the surrounding landscape. Another possibility is ritual. The elevated architecture, plazas, stairways, and monumental platforms could have created a ceremonial environment where political authority and religious practice were closely connected. Perhaps the hill itself held sacred significance. Perhaps the summit represented a symbolic connection between earth and sky. Or perhaps the practical advantages of elevation simply made the location ideal for a fortified settlement. These explanations do not necessarily contradict one another. Ancient cities rarely had only one purpose. A place could be a market, a fortress, a ceremonial center, and a political headquarters simultaneously. La Quemada may have been precisely this kind of multi-purpose landscape. But the site's defensive character remains difficult to ignore. Some walls are massive. Access routes become increasingly restricted as the visitor moves upward. The architecture appears to transform the natural hill into a series of controlled spaces. And then there is the question of the settlement's eventual abandonment. La Quemada was not occupied forever. At some point around the 9th century A.D., the site declined and was eventually abandoned. Why? Was there warfare? Climate change? Drought? political instability, economic disruption, or simply a gradual shift in regional settlement patterns. Archaeology can identify environmental and material changes, but it cannot always distinguish between their causes. A city can disappear for many reasons. Sometimes it is destroyed. Sometimes its population moves. Sometimes the political system that made the city important collapses elsewhere. Sometimes a route changes, and a settlement that once controlled movement loses its advantage. La Quemada's abandonment therefore remains part of a larger regional story that is still being reconstructed. The name itself adds another layer of confusion. La Quemada refers to burning, and traces of fire have contributed to the site's modern identity. But the presence of burned material does not automatically mean the settlement was destroyed in one catastrophic event. Fire can result from warfare. It can accompany abandonment. Buildings can burn accidentally. Wooden structures can be intentionally dismantled and burned. Ritual burning can also occur. Without precise archaeological context, the word burned can create an image of catastrophe that the evidence may not fully support. Still, the possibility of violent conflict cannot simply be ignored. The northern frontier of Mesoamerica was not always peaceful. Communities competed over resources, territory, and trade routes. Fortifications would have served a purpose in such an environment. Some researchers have interpreted La Quemada as part of a broader defensive system protecting communities farther south from groups moving through the northern frontier. Others have emphasized its role as a ceremonial and economic center, rather than a purely military stronghold. The debate continues because the site itself seems capable of supporting multiple interpretations, and that ambiguity has inspired more speculative ideas. Some popular theories have proposed that La Quemada was the legendary Chicomostoc, a mythical place of origin mentioned in later indigenous traditions. Others have attempted to connect the site with distant civilizations or migrations described in later sources. These interpretations are fascinating, but they remain unproven. The archaeological record does not provide enough evidence to identify La Quemada with a specific legendary homeland. What it does demonstrate is that sophisticated societies existed much farther north than simplistic models of ancient Mesoamerica once assumed. The people of La Quemada were not isolated. They participated in regional networks. They constructed monumental architecture. They adapted to a challenging environment. And they created a settlement whose scale suggests substantial social organization. Perhaps the most revealing feature is the landscape itself. The architecture seems to climb the mountain. Terraces rise one after another. Walls follow the slope. Stairways connect different levels. The higher you go, the more the surrounding country opens before you. From the summit, the settlement feels less like a collection of buildings and more like a carefully engineered mountain. That may have been intentional. Elevation can symbolize authority. The person standing above the valley sees farther. The person approaching from below must climb. Architecture can therefore transform physical height into social hierarchy. Whoever controlled the summit controlled not only the highest ground, but perhaps the symbolic center of the entire community. Yet, we cannot know whether the builders thought about the site in these terms. That is the problem with reconstructing ancient thought. Stone preserves decisions. It does not preserve intentions. A staircase tells us that people wanted movement between two levels. From the fortified heights of La Quemada, where walls transformed a mountain into a place of authority and defense, the journey now moves far to the north, into a landscape of immense silence. In the northern Arabian Peninsula, the desert stretches beneath an almost endless sky. Around the modern city of Sakaka, in the Al-Jaf region of Saudi Arabia, dark stone rises from the pale ground in a formation that seems strangely deliberate. 16 enormous standing stones, arranged in two roughly parallel rows, some reaching several meters into the air. Together, they form what is now known as the Rajajil standing stones. There are no towering pyramids here, no massive temples, no surviving inscriptions explaining the purpose of the monument, only stone, space, and an arrangement that has survived for thousands of years. And that simplicity makes Rajajil particularly difficult to understand. The name Rajajil is commonly translated from Arabic as men, because the stones can resemble a gathering of human figures standing silently across the desert. But the resemblance may be only visual. The monument itself is prehistoric, and its exact date and purpose remain subjects of archaeological discussion. Some estimates place the construction of the Rajajil groups in the 4th millennium BC, making them among the earliest known monumental stone arrangements in the Arabian Peninsula. If that dating is correct, the stones were raised during a period when communities across the region were beginning to develop more complex forms of social organization: agriculture, pastoralism, trade, and ritual. The Arabian Peninsula was not always the barren environment people imagine today. Climate conditions changed dramatically over thousands of years. During earlier periods, parts of Arabia experienced wetter conditions, supporting lakes, vegetation, animals, and human communities in places that are now arid. Rajajil therefore belongs to a very different environmental world. Its builders did not necessarily live in the desert landscape we see today. Perhaps the stones once stood near seasonal water sources or within a more hospitable environment. Perhaps the surrounding terrain supported pastoral communities that moved across the region, and perhaps the monument marked a place of gathering. But why standing stones? That question has no simple answer. Across the ancient world, upright stones appear in many contexts. They can mark graves, boundaries, sacred locations, territorial claims, gathering places, astronomical alignments, or monuments to people and events. The same basic form can emerge from entirely different cultural traditions. At Rajajil, the original function has been lost. The stones themselves offer clues, but no inscription provides an explanation. Some are broken. Some have fallen. Others remain upright. Their arrangement is irregular enough to resist the clean geometry seen at some later megalithic sites, yet organized enough to suggest intentional placement. That ambiguity is central to the mystery. Were the rows originally more precise? Have earthquakes, erosion, or human activity altered their arrangement? Were the stones intended to be viewed from one particular direction, or was their arrangement meaningful precisely because it was not symmetrical? Archaeologists have proposed several possibilities. One interpretation connects Rajajil with funerary or commemorative activity. Another considers the possibility of ritual gatherings. Others have suggested that the stones may have served as territorial or symbolic markers within a landscape used by mobile communities. Astronomical interpretations have also appeared in discussions of the site. The stones stand beneath an enormous open sky, making celestial observation an obvious possibility to modern observers. Could certain stones have marked the rising or setting positions of celestial bodies? Could seasonal changes in the sky have been incorporated into rituals? Such ideas are possible, but evidence is limited. A line of stones pointing toward a particular horizon does not automatically prove astronomical intention. Ancient people watched the sky for practical reasons as well as religious ones. The movement of the sun could help establish seasons. The stars could guide travel. The phases of the moon could structure time. Astronomical awareness, therefore, does not necessarily imply a sophisticated observatory. The more conservative explanation may be that the stones served as social or ritual markers within a community whose beliefs we can no longer reconstruct. Yet, the monument's scale still raises questions. Moving and raising stones several meters high requires organization. Even if individual stones were manageable, transporting them, preparing their positions, and setting them upright would have required coordinated effort. Who organized that labor? A chief? A religious specialist? A family group? An entire community? If Rajajil dates to the 4th millennium BC, then the society responsible was operating long before the monumental kingdoms that would later dominate the Near East. There were no written records to tell us who they were. Their political structures are unknown. Their language is unknown. Their names are unknown. But they were capable of monumental construction. This is perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of Rajajil. Monumental architecture does not necessarily require a centralized state. A community of pastoralists or farmers can cooperate to build something that carries meaning far beyond the lifetime of any individual participant. The stones can become a shared statement. We were here. We belong to this place. Our ancestors are remembered here. Or perhaps something more difficult to interpret. The surrounding region contains numerous prehistoric archaeological sites, including stone structures, burial monuments, rock art, and traces of ancient settlement. Together, they demonstrate that northern Arabia possessed complex cultural landscapes long before the rise of the better-known civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Rajajil should therefore not be treated as an isolated anomaly. It belongs to a broader prehistoric tradition. But its exact relationship to that tradition remains uncertain, and this uncertainty has created space for more speculative theories. Some fringe writers have described the stones as remnants of a forgotten astronomical system or evidence of a civilization possessing knowledge that later societies somehow lost. Others have compared Rajajil with megalithic monuments in Europe, suggesting a distant cultural connection between communities separated by thousands of kilometers. Such comparisons are intriguing. But resemblance alone is not proof of contact. Standing stones are a simple architectural concept. Different communities can independently discover that large upright rocks make effective markers, monuments, or ritual structures. To establish a real connection, archaeology would require stronger evidence. Shared artifacts, technologies, symbols, construction methods, or genetic and cultural links. At present, there is no compelling evidence that Rajajil was built by a civilization connected directly with distant European megalithic traditions. The more interesting mystery may be closer to home. What was happening in Arabia when these stones were raised? The 4th millennium BC was a period of profound change across the wider Near East. Communities were becoming increasingly settled in some regions. Long-distance exchange networks were expanding. Metalworking was emerging. Social differences were becoming more visible. Agricultural communities were developing new forms of organization. And yet, in parts of Arabia, mobile pastoralism remained an important way of life. Rajajil may reflect a society adapting to a changing environment. A monument can be especially valuable to mobile communities because it creates permanence in an otherwise shifting landscape. People may move, herds may move, water sources may change, but the stones remain. They create a fixed point, a place that can be returned to, a landmark that can outlive generations. Perhaps Rajajil served such a purpose. Perhaps it marked a seasonal meeting place where dispersed groups gathered. Perhaps rituals were performed there. Perhaps agreements were made. Perhaps ancestors were remembered. Or perhaps several of these functions existed simultaneously. The difficulty is that all of these possibilities can produce similar archaeological remains. A stone standing in the desert does not reveal the words spoken beside it. It does not reveal whether people prayed, traded, mourned, celebrated, or simply gathered. The landscape has preserved the architecture but erased the experience. And then there is the question of why some stones remain standing while others lie broken. Were they intentionally toppled? Did natural forces bring them down? Were they damaged during later periods? Could their original arrangement have been significantly different from what we see today? Without complete archaeological context, even the apparent geometry of the site must be treated cautiously. The stones may look like rows, but perhaps we are seeing only fragments of a much larger arrangement. That possibility is difficult to prove or disprove. Time has a way of simplifying monuments. A complex, prehistoric landscape can become a few surviving stones. A ceremonial center can become a field. A gathering place can become an archaeological site. The original meaning gradually contracts until only the physical object remains. Today, Rajajil stands beneath the open Saudi sky. The wind moves across the stones. There are no voices, no smoke from ancient fires, no people approaching from distant camps. Only the upright slabs remain, dark against the desert light. They may have marked the seasons. They may have honored the dead. The standing stones of Rajajil leave us with a landscape where silence itself seems monumental. Now, the journey moves westward again, across the Mediterranean, to the green countryside of western France, where prehistoric builders created not one isolated monument, but an entire landscape of enormous burial mounds. Near the village of Bougon, in the Deux-Sèvres region, several great earthen mounds rise gently from the surrounding fields. They do not look threatening. Grass covers their surfaces, trees grow nearby, and the landscape seems peaceful. But beneath those rounded hills are stone chambers constructed by people who lived thousands of years before written history. This is the Tumulus of Bougon, or more precisely, the Bougon Burial Complex, a group of monumental structures built and rebuilt across many centuries during the Neolithic period. At first glance, the mounds resemble natural hills. They are not. Each one is an architectural statement. Earth was collected, transported, shaped, and deliberately placed over stone chambers. Within several of the mounds are megalithic tombs containing human remains and objects associated with prehistoric funerary practices. The oldest monuments at Bougon date to approximately the 5th millennium BC, making them among the earliest monumental funerary structures in Western Europe. That date immediately changes the way we see the landscape. These structures were built thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge reached its later form, before written records documented the lives of kings. The people of Bougon lived in a world without writing, yet they created monuments that required planning, labor, and collective memory. Why? What compelled them to transform the earth into enormous artificial hills? The conventional explanation begins with burial. Several of the Bougon monuments contain chambers interpreted as collective tombs. Human remains were deposited within them over long periods, suggesting that the monuments were not necessarily intended for a single individual. Instead, they may have served communities, families, lineages, or groups connected by social and ritual traditions. This is important because a collective tomb changes the meaning of the monument. It is no longer simply a place where one person is buried. It becomes a place where the living maintain a relationship with generations who came before them. The architecture itself reinforces this connection. A passage leads inward. The visitor moves from the open landscape into a narrow corridor, then into a chamber. The journey becomes progressively more enclosed. Perhaps this physical movement had symbolic meaning. Perhaps entering the tomb represented crossing a boundary between ordinary life and the realm of the ancestors. Or perhaps the passage was simply a practical architectural solution. Without written testimony, both possibilities remain open. Bougon is especially fascinating because the complex contains several different monuments, constructed at different times. The site was not built according to a single master plan. Instead, it developed over generations. One group constructed a tomb. Later, communities returned. They built new monuments. They altered existing structures. They buried their dead. And eventually, the landscape became a concentration of monumental memory. This raises a profound question. Why return to the same place? Was the location already sacred? Did later generations recognize the importance of earlier monuments? Were they intentionally connecting themselves with ancestors whose names had already been forgotten? Perhaps the answer was all three. Prehistoric landscapes often show evidence that places accumulated meaning over long periods. Once a location became associated with ancestors or ritual activity, later communities could continue to use it even as their architecture and customs changed. At Bougon, this process is visible in stone and earth. The monuments overlap chronologically. Some were modified. Others were abandoned. Yet the general landscape remained significant. One of the most remarkable aspects of the complex is the engineering involved. The builders did not simply pile earth over stones. The tombs required carefully selected slabs, transportation, positioning, and structural planning. Large stones had to be moved into place and supported so that chambers could remain stable. Then, enormous quantities of earth were placed around them. All of this happened without wheeled vehicles or modern machinery. The people who built Bougon relied on human labor, simple tools, ropes, wooden supports, and an accumulated understanding of stone and soil. This does not make the monument impossible. It makes it impressive. And it forces us to think differently about prehistoric communities. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of organization. The absence of cities does not mean the absence of complex social structures. A community capable of constructing a megalithic tomb must have been able to coordinate labor, manage food supplies, transport materials, and maintain shared beliefs. But who made the decisions? Was there a hereditary elite? Religious specialists? Community leaders? Or did large groups cooperate through traditions that did not require centralized authority? Archaeology cannot yet provide a simple answer. The human remains create another layer of uncertainty. Collective tombs can contain individuals from different periods, sometimes representing generations of use. The dead may have been placed in different ways, and bones may have been moved or rearranged during later burials. This means that the chamber was not necessarily a final resting place in the modern sense. The relationship between the living and the dead may have been more dynamic. Perhaps bones were periodically moved. Perhaps particular individuals were treated differently. Perhaps the tomb functioned as a ritual space rather than simply a burial container. Such practices would make the monument less like a cemetery and more like a place where ancestors continued to participate symbolically in community life. That possibility is difficult to prove, but the architecture allows it. And then there is the question of the mound itself. Why hide the chamber beneath such an enormous mass of earth? The mound protected the structure. It also transformed it into a visible landmark. A burial chamber could have been left exposed. Instead, the builders created a hill. Perhaps the mound represented permanence. Perhaps it marked the sacred status of the interior. Perhaps it separated the dead from the world above. Or perhaps the mound served several purposes simultaneously. Across prehistoric Europe, burial mounds became powerful features of the landscape. They could function as territorial markers, ancestral monuments, gathering points, or symbols of social identity. Bougon appears to fit within this wider tradition, but its precise local meaning remains unknown. And naturally, the monument has attracted more speculative interpretations. Some writers have suggested that megalithic tombs such as Bougon were astronomical structures, intentionally aligned with celestial events. Others have imagined that prehistoric builders possessed an advanced understanding of geometry or engineering that has been underestimated by modern historians. There is some basis for taking prehistoric astronomical knowledge seriously. Ancient communities observed the sun, moon, and stars because celestial cycles influence seasons, agriculture, travel, and ritual. But the evidence at Bougon does not establish that the complex was designed primarily as an astronomical observatory. Nor is there evidence for a lost technology beyond the capabilities of Neolithic societies. The mystery is more subtle. Why did these people consider certain directions, places, stones, and ancestors important enough to reshape the landscape? That question is harder to answer than the mechanics of construction. A stone can tell us how it was positioned. It cannot tell us what a person felt while placing it there. A burial can tell us that someone was treated in a particular way. It cannot tell us what the community believed would happen afterward. A mound can survive, a belief cannot. And that may be why Bougon feels so distant despite its physical survival. The architecture is still here. The people are not. Their language has disappeared. Their stories have disappeared. Their names have disappeared. But the monument remains. For thousands of years, weather moved across the earth covering the tombs. Forests may have grown nearby. Fields changed. Communities rose and disappeared. Still, the mounds endured. At some point, their original meanings faded so completely that they became simply hills in the landscape. Then, archaeology returned. Excavation revealed that the hills were artificial. Stone chambers emerged. Human remains appeared. Objects once placed beside the dead returned to the light. The landscape began speaking again, but only in fragments. Today, the Tumulus of Bougon stands as one of the most remarkable examples of prehistoric monumental architecture in Western Europe. Its mystery is not that its builders could have created such structures. They clearly could. The mystery is what they believed they were creating. Were these tombs houses for the dead? Monuments to ancestry, sacred gateways, territorial markers? Places where the living communicated symbolically with generations beyond memory? Perhaps each monument had a different role. Perhaps its meaning changed over centuries, and perhaps the people who built the final mound were already standing in the shadow of traditions far older than themselves. That possibility is especially haunting. A monument can outlive its creators long enough to become ancient, even to the people who inherit it. The first builders may have known exactly why the stones were arranged. Centuries later, descendants may have remembered only that the place was important. And centuries after that, even the reason for its importance may have disappeared. Today, the grassy mounds seem peaceful. Nothing moves inside the ancient chambers. The stones remain where prehistoric hands placed them. Yet, beneath the earth are traces of people who lived, died, and were remembered in ways we can only partly reconstruct. Perhaps the next discovery will reveal another burial, an overlooked artifact, or a construction detail capable of changing our understanding of the entire complex. Or perhaps the essential meaning of Bougon is already lost forever. The mounds remain. The chambers remain. The ancestors remain only as fragments of bone and memory. And beneath those quiet hills lies a question that time has never completely answered. When the builders of Bougon raised these immense monuments for their dead, what did they believe was waiting on the other side of the stone? From the grassy burial mounds of Bougon, where earth concealed carefully constructed passage tombs and the memory of generations, the journey now moves toward the Atlantic coast of France, to a small island where stone carries a different kind of message. In the Gulf of Morbihan, off the southern coast of Brittany, the waters are often calm enough to reflect the sky like polished glass. Tidal channels wend between islands. Low hills rise from the shoreline, and ancient stones appear scattered throughout the landscape. On the island of Gavrinis, however, one monument is almost completely hidden beneath the earth. A rounded mound rises quietly above the island. From outside, it resembles a natural hill. Inside, it contains one of the most remarkable decorated passage graves of prehistoric Europe. This is Gavrinis. The monument was constructed during the Neolithic period, generally dated to around 3500 BC, although the precise chronology remains an area of ongoing study. Its builders belonged to communities living in Brittany thousands of years before written records. They left no explanation for the monument. Instead, they left stone, and on that stone, something extraordinary appears. Deep inside the passage, the walls are covered with carved designs, curving lines, geometric patterns, axes, crooks, shapes that resemble waves or serpents, interlocking forms that seem to move across the surface. Some of the carvings are so carefully executed that they appear almost deliberately abstract. At first, the passage is narrow and dark, then the carvings begin to emerge. The deeper one moves, the more elaborate the stone becomes. It is difficult not to wonder why prehistoric builders would invest so much effort in decorating a place that was eventually sealed beneath a mound. Who was supposed to see these images? Were they intended for the dead? For priests or ritual specialists? For selected members of the community? Or did the act of carving matter more than the number of people who would eventually see the finished work? The monument itself is a passage grave. A long corridor leads toward a central chamber, where human remains were once placed. The structure is constructed from large stone slabs, carefully arranged and covered by a substantial mound. Its basic function therefore appears familiar within the wider Neolithic tradition of Atlantic Europe. It was a funerary monument, but Gavrinis is far more than an ordinary burial chamber. Its interior decoration makes it exceptional. The builders transformed the passage into a visual environment. The stones are not merely structural, they are surfaces for communication. Yet, communication requires a shared language, and that language has been lost. The carvings cannot be read like writing. They do not clearly represent a known alphabet. Instead, they belong to a symbolic system whose meaning remains uncertain. Some motifs are recognizable as objects. One carved stone appears to show an axe or axe-like form. Another includes curved shapes that may represent tools, weapons, animals, plants, or abstract symbols. But even seemingly obvious interpretations can be deceptive. A shape that looks like an axe to a modern observer may have represented something completely different to the people who carved it. And this is where the mystery deepens. Gavrinis is not isolated from the wider megalithic landscape of Brittany. Nearby monuments contain related architectural traditions. Some carvings appear to share motifs with other Neolithic sites. This suggests that the builders participated in a broader cultural network. Ideas were moving, symbols were being repeated, monumental traditions were being passed from one generation to another. But the exact relationship between the monuments remains difficult to reconstruct. Did the same group of people build them? Were there traveling specialists who carved the stones? Were certain symbols copied from older monuments? Or did different communities share a common symbolic tradition? Archaeology can identify similarities. It cannot always explain how those similarities spread. The stones themselves provide another clue. Some slabs at Gavrinis appear to have been reused. One of the most fascinating discoveries is that certain decorated stones may have originally belonged to an earlier monument. This suggests that the builders of Gavrinis were not simply creating something new. They may have incorporated older sacred materials into the structure. If that interpretation is correct, the monument becomes even more interesting. Imagine a prehistoric community moving a stone that had already stood for generations. The original monument may have been dismantled, its stones transported, its symbols placed into a new architectural setting. The old meaning may have survived. Or perhaps the new builders understood the carvings differently. This possibility reveals something important about prehistoric memory. People do not always destroy the past when they build something new. Sometimes they preserve fragments of it. They carry them forward. They place them inside new structures. And eventually, the connection between the old and the new can become invisible. Gavrinis may contain exactly such a conversation between generations. The passage grave was not built randomly. Its location on a small island within the Gulf of Morbihan is significant. Water surrounds the monument. The island itself separates the tomb from the mainland. Was this separation meaningful? Perhaps. The sea may have represented a boundary. The island may have been a sacred place. The journey across the water may have formed part of the ritual. Or the location may have been selected for practical reasons that are now impossible to determine. Still, the combination of island, mound, passage, and decorated chamber creates an unusually powerful sequence. From water to land, from open landscape to mound, from daylight into darkness, from darkness into a chamber covered with symbols. That progression may have been intentional. The architecture creates a physical journey. But what kind of journey? Perhaps a funerary one. Perhaps symbolic. Perhaps connected with initiation. Some speculative interpretations have suggested that the passage represented a transition between different states of existence. Such ideas cannot be confirmed, but they fit a broader pattern found in many prehistoric ritual landscapes. The movement from outside to inside can naturally represent separation, transformation, or transition. Yet, we must be careful. Modern observers often interpret ancient monuments through symbolic frameworks that may have little connection with the original beliefs. A passage may simply be a passage. A chamber may simply be a burial space. A carving may simply be an image whose meaning has disappeared. The difficulty is knowing where reasonable interpretation ends and imagination begins. The astronomical possibilities at Gavrinis have also attracted attention. Some researchers have examined the monument's orientation and relationship with the surrounding landscape, including the movement of the sun. Neolithic communities clearly observed celestial cycles. The changing position of the sun determined seasons. The moon provided a visible rhythm of time. The stars offered orientation. But evidence that Gavrinis functioned specifically as an astronomical instrument remains limited. The monument may have incorporated knowledge of the sky without being an observatory in the modern sense. Perhaps the builders did not separate astronomy, religion, and daily life the way we do. The sky could have been part of ritual simply because it was part of existence. The most unsettling mystery, however, may be the carvings themselves. They are too deliberate to be random, too organized to be decoration in the modern sense. Yet they remain silent. No Rosetta Stone of Neolithic Brittany exists. There is no inscription telling us, this symbol means this. This chamber was used for this purpose. This stone belonged to this ancestor. We are left with patterns, and patterns invite interpretation. Some fringe theories have proposed that the carvings encode maps, astronomical diagrams, or even knowledge transmitted from a much older civilization. These ideas are difficult to substantiate. There is no reliable evidence that Gavrinis contains a literal map of the world, or an encoded record of an advanced civilization. But dismissing every unusual interpretation would also miss something important. The carvings clearly formed part of a sophisticated symbolic tradition. The builders possessed a visual language. We simply no longer understand its grammar. Perhaps the symbols represented myths. Perhaps they marked social identities. Perhaps they referred to tools, animals, ancestors, or supernatural beings. Perhaps their meaning changed depending on who was looking at them. The monument itself may have been the message. The passage forces movement. The stones control visibility. The darkness restricts perception. The carvings emerge gradually. A visitor would not see everything at once. That means the experience of entering the monument may have mattered as much as the objects inside. The builders were creating an atmosphere, not through modern technology, through architecture, stone, darkness, movement, silence, and time. Today, the mound at Gavrinis appears peaceful from the outside. The island is surrounded by water. The wind moves through the grass. The ancient structure seems almost hidden from the modern world. But inside, the carved stones remain. They were created more than 5,000 years ago by people whose names are unknown. The people who carved them probably understood exactly what they meant. The people who buried their dead there may have known the stories connected with each symbol. Then the monument was sealed. The generations changed. The language changed. The beliefs changed. And eventually, the original meaning disappeared. Yet the carvings survived. Perhaps they were never meant to be understood by us. Perhaps they were meant for the dead. Perhaps they recorded a story whose missing chapters once existed only in spoken memory. Or perhaps the symbols were part of a tradition so deeply familiar to their creators that explanation was unnecessary. The stones remain, but the voice behind them is gone. And somewhere within those looping lines, repeated shapes, and carefully carved surfaces may still lie the faint outline of a belief system that shaped an entire prehistoric landscape. The question is not simply what the carvings represent, it is why the builders believed they needed to carve them at all, and what they intended the darkness of Gavrinis to preserve when the final stone was placed and the outside world was left behind. From the dark interior of Gavrinis, where carved symbols remain locked inside stone long after their meanings have faded, the journey now crosses the Mediterranean to the island of Sardinia. Here, another ancient landscape holds its dead underground, but the entrances are cut not from assembled slabs, but directly into the living rock. Near the northwestern coast of the island, outside the city of Alghero, low outcrops of soft stone are pierced by openings leading into darkness. From above, the ground appears almost ordinary. Yet, within it lies a vast prehistoric cemetery. This is the necropolis of Anghelu Ruju. More than 30 rock-cut tombs have been discovered here, forming one of the largest and most important prehistoric necropolises in Sardinia. The tombs are part of the island's remarkable tradition of underground burial chambers known as Domus de Janas, a Sardinian name meaning houses of the fairies, or, more literally, houses of the witches. The ancient people who created them never used that name. Their own words have disappeared. But the name is revealing. Long after the original builders were gone, later communities still recognized that these mysterious openings in the rock belonged to something outside ordinary experience. A doorway in a cliff. A passage descending into the earth. A chamber shaped to resemble a house. For people who no longer knew their purpose, such places naturally invited stories. According to Sardinian folklore, supernatural beings were believed to inhabit the Domus de Janas. Small doors and underground rooms seemed too unusual to be ordinary houses, yet they clearly showed signs of deliberate human work. The original explanation had been lost. Myth moved into the empty space. Archaeology, however, reveals a much older story. The tombs of Anghelu Ruju were first discovered in the early 20th century, when quarrying activity exposed structures beneath the ground. Excavations revealed that the site had been used during the late Neolithic and continued to hold importance during later prehistoric periods. The earliest phases are generally associated with Sardinia's Ozieri culture, beginning around the 4th millennium BC. That means these underground chambers were created more than 9,000 years ago. Their builders possess no written system that can explain their beliefs to us. Yet, they were capable of carving complex spaces directly into stone. Some chambers contain multiple rooms. Passages connect one space to another. Doorways are shaped into the rock. Architectural details imitate elements of houses built above ground. And, in some cases, the walls preserve carved or painted symbolic features. The dead were not simply placed in holes. They were given a constructed environment, a home of stone, or perhaps something intended to resemble one. Why would a prehistoric community create houses for the dead? The most widely accepted interpretation is connected with belief in continuity between life and death. If the living occupied houses, perhaps the dead were imagined as requiring a similar dwelling. The tomb could represent an afterlife residence, a symbolic home, a place where ancestors continued to exist in another form. But such ideas cannot be directly proven. No surviving Neolithic text tells us what happened inside these chambers. There is no inscription explaining the ritual. The evidence consists of architecture, human remains, burial objects, and symbols. From these fragments, archaeologists attempt to reconstruct a worldview. And the deeper one enters Anghelu Ruju, the more that reconstruction becomes uncertain. Some of the tombs contain carvings that have been interpreted as horns or stylized animal imagery. In Sardinian prehistoric archaeology, horned motifs are often associated with cattle or bulls, animals that may have carried symbolic importance. But what exactly did they represent? Power? Fertility? Wealth? Protection? A deity? Or simply an image familiar to the community? The answer depends partly on comparison with other sites. Similar motifs appear elsewhere in Sardinia, suggesting that they belong to a broader symbolic tradition. But similarity does not provide translation. We may recognize the repeated image while still not understanding the story behind it. A symbol can survive long after the meaning attached to it has disappeared. The tombs themselves may also preserve a memory of prehistoric architecture that no longer survives above ground. This is one of Anghelu Ruju's most fascinating features. Many Neolithic houses were constructed from materials that decay quickly: wood, reeds, clay, and other organic elements. The stone tombs, however, endured. If their interiors were designed to imitate domestic structures, they may offer indirect evidence of what ordinary prehistoric houses once looked like. The dead, in this sense, may have preserved the memory of the living. A carved ceiling can suggest a roof. A false doorway can suggest an entrance. A chamber can suggest a room. But again, certainty is impossible. The builders may have been creating symbolic spaces rather than literal copies of houses. The tomb may have resembled a dwelling because the boundary between home and grave carried religious meaning. Perhaps entering the chamber was imagined as returning to an ancestral house. Perhaps the underground world was thought of as a continuation of the human settlement above. Or perhaps the architecture served a ritual function that modern observers have not yet recognized. The use of red pigment adds another layer of mystery. At some Sardinian prehistoric tombs, traces of ochre or red coloration have been found, and Anghelu Ruju is associated with this broader practice of using color within funerary contexts. Red has been interpreted in many ways. It may have symbolized blood, life, rebirth, transformation, or something entirely different. Modern interpretations often connect red ochre with ideas of renewal because similar practices occur at prehistoric burials elsewhere. But repeated use across different cultures does not guarantee identical beliefs. The people of Anghelu Ruju had their own symbolic world. We can only see its surviving outlines. The burial evidence reveals that the tombs were used repeatedly. This was not a landscape created for a single funeral. Generations returned to these chambers. Bodies and bones accumulated. The same spaces were reopened. The dead were placed alongside those who had come before. That act of returning may have been as important as the original burial. Each reopening connected the present community with an older one. A new death entered a space already occupied by memory. And this raises an unsettling possibility. How did the living experience these tombs? Imagine approaching one of the small entrances at dusk. The Sardinian landscape outside is bright and open. Then the doorway narrows. The light fades. The temperature changes. The stone walls close around you. Inside may lie the remains of ancestors who had been placed there years, or generations, earlier. For the people who used Anghelu Ruju, this may not have been frightening. It may have been familiar, sacred, necessary. The modern sense of horror comes partly from our own separation from the dead. In many prehistoric communities, the boundary may have been less absolute. The ancestors remained physically present. Their bones could be visited. Their resting places could become centers of ritual. The dead were not removed entirely from society. They remained within its symbolic landscape. Yet, the necropolis also contains evidence of change. The site was not frozen in one cultural moment. Different periods left traces of their own practices. Objects found within or associated with the tombs show that later communities continued to interact with these ancient spaces. This is a recurring pattern in archaeology. A sacred place can survive changes in language, technology, and society. People may no longer understand why the first monument was created. Still, they recognize that the location carries importance. They return. They adapt it. They add their own rituals. Eventually, one monument contains the memories of several different worlds. Anghelu Ruju may be exactly such a place. This layered history has encouraged more speculative theories. Some writers have suggested that the Domus de Janus were not merely tombs, but ceremonial centers connected with secret initiation rituals, forgotten priesthoods, or forms of knowledge that disappeared from later Sardinian culture. Others have proposed that their architectural precision reflects techniques inherited from a much older civilization. There is no compelling archaeological evidence requiring these explanations. Prehistoric Sardinian communities were fully capable of organizing labor, carving stone, and creating complex symbolic architecture. The mystery does not lie in an inability to explain the tools. It lies in the purpose. Why were particular chambers shaped in particular ways? Why were some decorated while others were not? Why did the same landscape remain important through changing periods? And why did later generations remember these underground spaces not as tombs, but as dwellings of supernatural beings? The folklore surrounding the Domus de Janus may not preserve the literal beliefs of the Neolithic builders. But it demonstrates something else. The monuments never became invisible. Their presence continued to demand explanation. A people could forget the builders and still feel that the structures belonged to a world beyond ordinary life. That is the strange endurance of ancient architecture. A tomb can survive after the memory of death has faded. A doorway can survive after the language of its makers has disappeared. A symbol can survive after its meaning has become inaccessible. Today, Anghelu Ruju lies quiet beneath the Sardinian sky. The entrances still lead underground. The chambers remain cool and dark. The carved details continue to suggest a world of prehistoric houses, ancestors, animals, and beliefs. Yet the people who created that world left no direct voice behind. We can reconstruct their tools. We can study their bones. We can date their pottery. We can compare their symbols. But we cannot ask them what they believed waited beyond the final doorway. Perhaps the tombs were houses for the dead. Perhaps they were ritual stages where the living negotiated their relationship with ancestry. Perhaps the underground chambers represented a return to the earth from which life emerged. Or perhaps their meaning combined ideas that modern language cannot easily separate. Somewhere within the rock-cut passages of Anghelu Ruju, there may still be a clue waiting to be recognized. A pattern in the carvings, an overlooked burial sequence, or evidence that changes everything we think we know about the people who entered these dark chambers thousands of years ago. Until then, the necropolis remains a city of the dead with no surviving map of its beliefs. The entrances are open, the rooms are silent, and the oldest question remains where it has always been. Inside the stone, waiting for someone to understand why the people of prehistoric Sardinia built homes beneath the earth, and what they believed their ancestors were doing there when the last living visitor finally stepped back into the light. The underground chambers of Anghelu Ruju leave us with the image of a prehistoric world carved into stone, where the boundary between home, tomb, and sacred space became almost impossible to separate. From Sardinia, the journey now moves across the Mediterranean and deep into the Andes, where another enigmatic monument appears not beneath the earth, but spread across a broad stone surface high in the Peruvian mountains. At more than 3,000 meters above sea level, near the town of Sayhuite in southern Peru, the landscape opens into a vast highland of grass, rock, and distant peaks. The air is thin. Clouds move quickly across the mountains, and among the ancient stones lies an object unlike an ordinary monument. A massive block of granite covered with hundreds of carved forms. Tiny terraces, channels, stairways, ponds, animals, human figures, shrines, and miniature landscapes. This is the Sayhuite stone, sometimes described as a stone labyrinth or ceremonial model. Its surface appears almost like a world carved into rock, and the longer one looks, the more difficult it becomes to decide what it represents. At first, the explanation seems straightforward. The stone is generally associated with the Inca period and is located near an important archaeological complex containing terraces, platforms, and ceremonial features. The surrounding site of Sayhuite was used before and during the expansion of the Inca state. Although its precise history is complex, the stone itself is usually interpreted as a ritual object or ceremonial model. But a model of what? That is where the mystery begins. The carved surface contains an extraordinary collection of miniature forms. Some resemble agricultural terraces. Others look like pools, channels, stairways, temples, animals, and human beings. The forms are not arranged as a simple geometric diagram. They seem to create a miniature environment, a landscape reduced to stone. Could it have represented an idealized settlement, a sacred geography, an irrigation system, a training device for architects or engineers, or something connected with religious ceremony? No surviving Inca document gives us a definitive answer, and this is one of the fundamental difficulties of studying the Inca world. The Inca civilization did not leave behind a conventional written alphabet comparable to those of many Old World civilizations. Information was transmitted through oral traditions, material culture, architecture, administrative systems, and systems of knotted cords known as quipu. Much of the intellectual world behind their monuments must therefore be reconstructed indirectly. The Sayhuite stone offers an unusually visual form of evidence. But visual evidence can be deceptive. A carved shape may resemble something familiar to modern eyes without representing that object at all. One figure may look like a llama, another may resemble a frog. A stepped form may look like a terrace. A depression may appear to be a pool. Perhaps the builders intended exactly those things. Perhaps they did not. The surface becomes a puzzle because it contains recognizable elements without providing their key. The most common interpretation connects the monument with hydraulic or architectural planning. The Andes are a landscape dominated by water management. Rainfall varies dramatically between regions. Mountain slopes are steep. Agricultural land is limited. Communities therefore developed sophisticated systems of terraces, canals, reservoirs, and drainage. The Inca inherited and expanded many of these technologies. A stone containing miniature channels and terraces could plausibly have been connected with this practical knowledge. Perhaps it served as a symbolic representation of water flow. Perhaps ritual and engineering were intertwined. After all, for Andean societies, water was not simply a resource. It was essential to agriculture, survival, and religious life. Mountains, springs, rivers, and lakes could all possess sacred significance. A model of water moving through a landscape might therefore have carried both practical and spiritual meaning. Yet, the Sayhuite stone contains more than channels. Animals appear throughout the carved surface. Some have been interpreted as frogs, reptiles, birds, llamas, felines, and other creatures. Their presence has encouraged another interpretation, that the monument may have represented a sacred, cosmological landscape. The Andes were not understood merely as physical geography. Mountains could be sacred beings. Natural features could be associated with ancestors or supernatural forces. Certain animals held symbolic importance. A stone landscape filled with miniature living creatures could therefore have been more than a technical model. It might have represented an ordered universe. But again, the evidence is incomplete. The exact date of the stone remains uncertain. Its relationship with the surrounding architecture is also difficult to establish with absolute precision. The site predates the final expansion of the Inca state, and the Inca may have incorporated an existing sacred place into their own political and religious system. This is important. When the Inca expanded across the Andes, they did not simply erase earlier traditions. They often incorporated local sacred places, deities, and institutions into a larger imperial framework. Sayhuite may therefore preserve traditions older than the Inca themselves. If so, the stone could represent an earlier conceptual world later absorbed into Inca culture. This possibility makes the monument even more difficult to interpret. Who carved it? An Inca specialist? A local community? A group working under imperial authority? Or artisans following traditions that had existed for generations? We do not know. And there is another intriguing feature. The monument is not simply a flat diagram. Its surface is deeply sculpted. The carver created elevations and depressions, creating a miniature topography. Some areas rise, others descend. Channels cross between them. Steps lead from one level to another. The effect is almost tactile. It invites the viewer to move the eyes across the stone as though traveling through a landscape. That has led some researchers and popular writers to compare it with a three-dimensional map. Perhaps that is partly correct. But map is a modern category. A modern map primarily communicates geographic information. A sacred model can communicate something very different. It can represent relationships between places, forces, beings, and rituals. The Sayhuite stone may not have been intended to tell someone where to go. It may have been intended to show how a particular world was organized. That world could have included both physical geography and spiritual meaning. Some speculative interpretations go further. The stone has occasionally been described as evidence of an advanced Inca understanding of hydraulic engineering, surveying, or even three-dimensional planning techniques that seem surprisingly sophisticated. There is nothing inherently implausible about Inca engineers possessing sophisticated practical knowledge. Their agricultural terraces and road systems demonstrate extraordinary engineering abilities. Their bridges, drainage systems, and mountain settlements required careful observation and planning. The real mystery is how the stone functioned within that knowledge. Was it instructional, ceremonial, symbolic, or perhaps all three? Fringe theories have also suggested that the stone was a kind of ancient city plan, depicting settlements that no longer exist. Others have proposed that it encoded hidden geographical information. Some interpretations have even imagined that its strange arrangement represents a lost map of an unknown region. There is no reliable evidence establishing such claims. Yet, the fascination persists because the monument genuinely looks like something between a model and a ritual object. Its forms are too varied to resemble a simple geometric exercise. Its imagery is too concrete to dismiss as pure abstraction, and its original purpose remains uncertain. Perhaps that ambiguity was intentional. A sacred object does not necessarily need to explain itself. Its meaning may have been understood through ceremonies, stories, and oral knowledge that disappeared long ago. Imagine standing before the stone centuries ago. You would not see an archaeological puzzle. You would see something familiar. The miniature channels might correspond to real irrigation systems. The animals might carry meanings known to everyone present. The terraces might resemble sacred mountainsides. The human figures might represent ancestors, deities, or participants in a ritual. Nothing would need explanation, because the surrounding culture provided the missing context. Today, that context is largely gone. The stone remains. The language of the stone does not. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Sayhuite. Archaeological objects can preserve form while losing meaning. A carving can survive perfectly while the story that made it significant disappears. The result is a strange reversal. The better preserved the monument, the more confidently we can see it, and the less certain we may be about what we are seeing. The surrounding site adds another layer. Sayhuite contains terraces and carved stones associated with ritual activity. Its location in the highlands would have connected it with the dramatic Andean environment, where mountains dominate the horizon. The relationship between the monument and its landscape may have been fundamental. Perhaps the stone represented the surrounding world in miniature. Perhaps it allowed ritual specialists to manipulate a symbolic landscape. Perhaps it served as a place where water, agriculture, animals, and sacred geography were brought together. Or perhaps its function was something more ordinary that has been transformed into mystery by the passage of time. There is no reason to assume every unexplained feature was supernatural. Ancient engineers were capable of practical ingenuity. Ancient artists were capable of abstraction. Ancient religious specialists were capable of combining both. The difficulty lies in separating those possibilities. Today, the Sayhuite stone remains one of the Andes' most intriguing carved monuments. Its surface still contains its miniature world. Channels still cross the granite. Figures still emerge from the stone. Small forms appear frozen in a landscape that no longer speaks. Perhaps future research will determine more precisely when the monument was carved, who created it, and how it related to the surrounding ceremonial complex. Perhaps new discoveries will reveal similar stones elsewhere, providing the missing comparison. Or perhaps the stone will continue to resist a single interpretation: a map, a model, a ritual landscape, a teaching device, a sacred representation of the Andean world. Maybe it was several of these things at once. The people who carved it may never have separated those categories. For them, water could be engineering and sacred force. A mountain could be geography and ancestor. An animal could be biological creature and spiritual symbol. A miniature landscape could therefore represent far more than physical terrain. It could represent a way of understanding existence itself, and that is where the mystery of Sayhuite quietly deepens. The stone does not merely show a landscape. It may preserve a fragment of how an ancient society imagined the relationship between humans, nature, water, animals, and the sacred. We can study every carved channel. We can photograph every figure. We can measure every depression. but the meaning behind them remains partly concealed. High in the Andes, the stone still holds its miniature world. And perhaps somewhere within that maze of carved paths is an idea that its makers considered obvious, a key to the monument's purpose that has been lost not in the stone itself, but in the minds of the people who once knew how to read it.